I am Donovan. I am 71 years old. I spent my entire life building an empire from the ground up so my son would never know what it means to be hungry. But last Thanksgiving, my daughter-in-law slid a printed bank statement across the dining table, smiled at me, and demanded every dime of my savings. She told me I was a freeloader in my own home. I did not yell. I just walked out into the cold night, and by the next morning, the financial fortress they thought they owned was burning to the ground. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to teach an arrogant person a lesson they will never forget. The smell of roasted turkey and expensive sage stuffing filled the massive dining room of the main house. It was a beautiful home, a home with towering ceilings, wide plank oak floors, and massive glass windows that looked out over 3 acres of manicured lawns. It was Thanksgiving evening. The dining table was set with fine crystal and gold-plated silverware. Brittany, my son Derek's wife, had hired a private chef to cater the dinner. She sat at the head of the table wearing a silk dress, swirling a glass of imported red wine. Derek sat across from her wearing a cashmere sweater, looking every bit the successful architect he portrayed to the world. And I sat at the side quietly eating my meal. I missed my late wife, Rosalind. When Rosalind was alive, Thanksgiving meant a house full of laughter, the smell of homemade sweet potato pie, and a feeling of genuine gratitude. We did not have gold-plated silverware back then. We had paper plates and a small, cramped kitchen. For 40 years, I ran a commercial heating and cooling business. I spent decades crawling through dusty ventilation shafts, hauling heavy equipment up flights of stairs, and breathing in fiberglass insulation. I broke my back so my family could have a solid foundation. I built a life that allowed my son to have soft hands. Perhaps that was my first mistake. I made his life too comfortable. I shielded him from the harsh reality of the world, and in doing so, I raised a man who did not know how to defend his own blood. The dinner conversation had been mostly about Brittany and her wealthy friends. I listened without interrupting. I was used to being the quiet observer in their home. I lived in the guest house on the property, a modest 2-bedroom cottage about 50 yards from the main house. I kept to myself. I maintained the grounds. I paid for my own groceries. I never asked them for a single dime. But to Brittany, my mere presence on the estate was an inconvenience. She tolerated me with thinly veiled contempt, as if I were a stray dog they had taken in out of pity. Dessert was served. A slice of pecan pie was placed in front of me. I took a sip of my black coffee. That was when the atmosphere in the room completely shifted. Brittany cleared her throat. She set her wine glass down and reached into her designer handbag resting on the empty chair beside her. She pulled out a folded piece of paper. The crisp sound of the paper unfolding echoed in the quiet room. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table, and slid the paper across the polished oak surface until it stopped right next to my coffee cup. I looked down. It was a bank statement from my personal checking account. The balance printed clearly at the bottom was $250,000. A cold chill washed over me. Not out of fear, but out of a sudden, intense realization of a massive boundary violation. That statement had been mailed directly to the guest house. She had gone into my personal mailbox, opened my private mail, and brought it to the dinner table. I looked up at her. She was smiling. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a predator who thought she had finally cornered her prey. "Donovan," she began, her voice dripping with a sickly sweet condescension. "Derek and I have been talking. You know I am launching my new luxury lifestyle brand next month. It is going to be massive. But we need a little more seed capital to really get the marketing off the ground." I did not touch the paper. I just stared at her, waiting for the punchline. "We saw your statement," she continued, waving her manicured hand dismissively. "You have $250,000 just sitting there doing absolutely nothing. You are an old man. You do not travel. You do not buy nice things. You do not need this kind of money." I glanced at Derek. He was suddenly very interested in his napkin, refusing to make eye contact with me. "So here is what we decided," Brittany said, leaning back and crossing her arms. "You are going to transfer that money into our joint account by Monday morning. Think of it as an investment in our future. Besides, it is only fair." I finally spoke. My voice was calm and completely flat. "Only fair?" I asked. "Yes," she snapped, her tone sharpening. You have been living in our guest house for free for over 3 years since Rosalind died. You do not pay rent, you use our electricity, you use our water, you eat the food we provide at family dinners. Do you have any idea how much a property like this costs to maintain? We are basically running a charity for you. You owe us Donovan. You owe us for putting a roof over your head. So give us the savings or you need to pack your things and move out by the end of the weekend. I am not running a free nursing home. The silence that followed her words was suffocating. I could hear the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. I could hear my own steady heartbeat. I did not look at the bank statement again. I looked directly at my son, the boy I had raised, the boy I had protected from the racism and the struggles of the streets. I remembered the day he got his acceptance letter to architecture school. I wept that day. I took every dollar I had saved that month and bought him a tailored charcoal gray suit for his interviews. I told him to walk into those corporate offices with his head held high because his father had already paid the price for his seat at the table. "Derek," I said softly, "is this what you want? Is this how you see me?" Derek shifted uncomfortably in his expensive chair. He rubbed the back of his neck, a nervous habit he had since he was a child. He finally looked at me, but his eyes were completely empty of courage. "Dad, you know business has been a little slow lately," he mumbled, his voice barely above a whisper. "Brittany has a really solid business plan. The brand could really take off. And she is right about the guest house. It is a prime piece of real estate. We could be renting it out for thousands a month. We need the capital. It is just business, Dad, just business." The words hung in the air. In that exact fraction of a second, the paternal instinct inside me withered and died. The father who would do anything for his son was gone. What remained was Donovan the businessman, the man who had survived cutthroat contractors, unpaid invoices, and brutal renters. The man who knew exactly how to dismantle a structure by removing its load-bearing pillars. I did not feel anger. Anger is an emotion reserved for people who feel powerless. I felt an overwhelming sense of clarity. I saw them for exactly who they were. Brittany was a parasite drunk on unearned privilege, and my son was a coward who had sold his soul and his bloodline for the illusion of peace with a woman who did not even respect him. They thought they held all the cards. They thought they were the lords of the manor evicting a helpless old man. They did not know the truth. They did not know the secret I had kept to protect Derek's fragile ego. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I did not throw my plate against the wall or try to explain the sacrifices I had made. You cannot explain sacrifice to people who have only ever known entitlement. I reached out and picked up my coffee cup. I took one final, slow sip. The coffee was lukewarm now, but it tasted like absolute freedom. I set the cup down gently on the saucer. I placed my cloth napkin on the table next to my untouched pecan pie. Then I stood up. I smoothed the wrinkles from my trousers. "I understand," I said simply. Brittany smirked, her eyes gleaming with victory. "I knew you would see it our way," she said. "I will email you the routing numbers tonight. Have the bank wire it first thing Monday." I did not respond. I turned my back on them and walked out of the dining room. I walked through the grand foyer, out the heavy mahogany front doors, and stepped into the crisp November night. The cold air hit my face, but I felt entirely warm inside. I walked across the lawn to the guest house, the place I had called home for 3 years. I walked into my bedroom and pulled an old faded canvas duffel bag from the top of the closet. I did not pack the television. I did not pack the expensive watches Derek had bought me for my past birthdays. I only packed the things that truly belonged to me. A few changes of clothes, my toiletry bag, a framed photograph of Rosalind, and my battered leather portfolio containing my legal documents. I looked around the small bedroom one last time. This guest house was supposed to be my quiet sanctuary. I remembered when I drew the blueprints for this entire estate. I remembered signing the trust documents. I made sure every piece of land, every brick, every pipe was legally protected under an irrevocable trust. A trust I controlled entirely. Derek was legally nothing more than a month-to-month tenant, a tenant who just allowed his wife to evict the landlord. It took me exactly 10 minutes to pack my entire life into that single bag. I walked back out of the guest house, locking the door behind me. I walked down the long paved driveway toward the main gate. As I reached the end of the driveway, the front door of the main house swung open. Brittany stood on the porch, the warm light from the foyer spilling out around her. "Where do you think you are going?" she shouted, her voice echoing in the quiet neighborhood. "You cannot just walk away. You have nowhere to go. You will be freezing in a motel tonight. You will be back here begging us tomorrow morning." I stopped for a brief moment. I did not turn around to look at her. I had just adjusted the strap of my duffel bag on my shoulder and kept walking into the dark street. She was right about one thing. I was going to a motel tonight. But she was dead wrong about everything else. I was not going to be begging tomorrow. Tomorrow, I was going to wake up and make a single phone call. A phone call that would trigger a financial avalanche they could not possibly survive. I walked to my old truck parked near the gates. It was a 1998 Ford. Not flashy, but the engine was strong. I threw the duffel bag onto the passenger seat and turned the key. The engine roared to life, shattering the quiet of their upscale neighborhood. As I pulled out onto the main road, I looked in the rearview mirror one last time. Because what Brittany and Derek did not know, what Derek had somehow forgotten in his years of living a soft, luxurious life, was that his architecture firm was not his. The cars they drove were not theirs. And the massive multi-million-dollar estate they were standing on, the estate where they had just evicted me, did not belong to them either. I built it all. I owned it all. And they were about to find out what happens when the man who laid the foundation decides it is time to tear the house down. The drive away from the massive estate was incredibly quiet. I navigated my old Ford truck down the familiar winding roads, leaving behind the towering oak trees and the heavy wrought iron gates of the property I had built with my own two hands. I did not drive to a friend house to complain. I did not call my lawyer to file a grievance. I simply drove until I reached the city limits and found a run-down extended stay motel right off the noisy interstate. It was the kind of place with flickering neon signs and faded paint peeling off the exterior concrete walls. I walked into the small lobby and paid for a week in advance using crisp $100 bills from my wallet. The clerk behind the scratched plexiglass window did not ask any questions about why an old man was checking in so late on a holiday weekend. He just handed me a brass key attached to a heavy plastic diamond. Room 112. I parked my truck right outside the door and carried my single canvas duffel bag inside. The room smelled faintly of stale cigarette smoke and cheap pine disinfectant. The carpet was worn thin near the bed, and the television was an old, bulky model bolted to the cheap wooden dresser. It was a massive departure from the luxurious guest house I had just left behind. But to me, it was perfectly fine. It was quiet. It was a secure place to sit down and think. I placed my bag on the squeaky mattress and sat down heavily. For a long time, I just stared at the blank television screen. Any other father might have cried. Any other man my age might have felt a crushing sense of defeat after being thrown out by his own flesh and blood. But I did not feel defeated. I felt a cold, sharp clarity settling over my mind. I thought about my late wife, Rosalind. I wondered what she would say if she could see our son, Derek, right now. She used to tell me that Derek had a soft heart, but I realized now that his heart was not soft at all. It was completely hollow. He had let an arrogant woman take the reins of his life, and he was simply too afraid to take them back. I took off my heavy work boots, lay down on the firm mattress, and went to sleep. I slept better that night than I had in years. I woke up at 5 in the morning. It was a permanent habit ingrained in my bones from 40 years of working as a commercial heating and cooling contractor. My body did not know how to sleep past dawn. I got up, washed my face in the small cracked sink, and put on my work clothes, a sturdy pair of denim jeans and a thick flannel shirt. I walked across the empty parking lot to a nearby diner and ordered a plate of scrambled eggs, black coffee, and dry toast. I sat alone in the corner booth, watching the sun slowly rise over the busy highway, watching the heavy transport trucks rumble past. I took my time chewing my food. I had no place to be and no urgent tasks to complete today. My mobile phone sat quietly on the table next to my ceramic coffee mug. It was not until exactly 8 o'clock that the screen suddenly lit up. It vibrated against the table with an angry buzzing sound. I picked it up and looked at the display. It was a text message from my daughter-in-law, Brittany. She had attached a high-resolution photograph to the message. I tapped the screen to open the picture. It was a close-up shot of the front door of my guest house. But the old solid brass deadbolt I had installed 10 years ago was completely gone. In its place was a sleek, black digital smart lock glowing with a bright blue circular light. Below the photograph, she had typed a long and mocking message. She wrote that the locks were officially changed and that the property was now fully secured against trespassers. She told me not to even think about coming back to steal anything from her property. She said she would have my old clothes thrown into black garbage bags and left on the curb for the trash collectors early tomorrow morning. She ended the message by saying I was officially locked out of their successful lives and that I should enjoy my pathetic new life living on the streets. I read the cruel words twice. I looked closely at the photograph of the shiny new smart lock. A younger version of me might have felt a massive surge of rage. A younger version of me might have driven straight back to the estate, grabbed a heavy iron crowbar from the back of my truck, and smashed that fancy plastic lock into 100 broken pieces. But anger makes a man foolish. Anger makes a man play directly into the hands of his enemies. I did not reply to her message. I did not call Derek to complain about his wife. I just finished my bitter black coffee, left a $5 tip on the table, and walked calmly back to my motel room. Brittany honestly thought she had won the war. She truly believed that by hiring an emergency locksmith on a holiday weekend, she had completely neutralized me. She thought that a piece of plastic and a digital keypad were enough to keep me away from my own property. She looked at me and only saw an obsolete old man who did not understand modern technology. She saw an old African-American contractor in dirty boots and assumed I was ignorant. That was her absolute fatal mistake. She only saw the polished surface of things. She did not know the deep history of the ground she was currently walking on. When I built the main house and the guest house 5 years ago, I did not hire outside contractors to do the electrical wiring. I did it all myself. Every single copper wire running through those thick walls, every circuit breaker, every hidden security camera, and every automated system was installed by my own hands. I built that sprawling estate to be a secure fortress for my family. And when you build a fortress, you always make sure you hold the master keys to the gates. I did not just install simple mechanical locks. I wired the entire property into a highly advanced master estate management portal. I integrated the climate control, the security parameters, the external lighting, and the financial automated payments into one central digital hub. I had given Derek a secondary user account so he could manage his day-to-day life, but I had secretly kept the master administrative rights for myself. Derek was always too lazy to learn how the complex system actually worked, and Brittany was far too arrogant to ever ask. I walked into room 112 and locked the cheap wooden door behind me. I went to my canvas duffel bag and pulled out my heavy-duty laptop. It was a thick industrial model built to withstand dust and drops on construction sites, but the processor inside was incredibly fast. I sat down at the small laminate desk near the window, plugged the laptop into the wall outlet, and pressed the power button. The screen glowed to life, illuminating my face in the dim room. I connected the laptop to the secure mobile hotspot on my phone. I opened a web browser and typed in the complex alphanumeric web address for the private estate portal. A sleek black login screen appeared. I entered my secure master credentials. The administrative dashboard loaded instantly. The screen was filled with real-time data streams, green indicator lights, and detailed schematics of the entire 3-acre property. I could see absolutely everything from this chair. I could see that the heating system in the main house was set to a comfortable 72 degrees. I could see the live feed of the security cameras showing the empty paved driveway. And I could see the exact operational status of the shiny new smart lock Brittany had just installed on the guest house door. The system recognized the new unauthorized hardware, but it also recognized my ultimate master override authority. I could have clicked one single button and unlocked that door from miles away. I could have triggered the alarm system to ring loud enough to shatter her expensive wine glasses. I could have plunged the entire main house into total darkness. But those actions were petty. Those actions were small. I did not want to play childish pranks. I wanted to teach a permanent lesson about reality. I navigated away from the security tab and clicked on the financial management section of the portal. This was the true beating heart of the estate. This was the quiet, invisible system that kept their luxurious lifestyle afloat day after day. For years, I had set up automated drafts from my commercial accounts to handle the incredibly heavy burdens of the property. I paid for it all without complaining so Derek could focus entirely on building his architecture firm. I scrolled slowly through the long list of recurring monthly payments. The numbers were absolutely staggering. There was the massive automated payment for the county property taxes, which amounted to thousands of dollars every single quarter. There was the premium landscaping service that came twice a week to trim the hedges and maintain the exotic flower beds Brittany insisted on having. There was the massive utility bill for the heated swimming pool and the central air conditioning running constantly in a house with vaulted ceilings. There was the high-speed fiber optic internet, the premium cable television packages, and the private neighborhood security patrol fees. Brittany walked around thinking she was a highly successful, wealthy woman. She thought her little lifestyle brand and Derek's struggling firm were paying for all of this luxury. She had absolutely no idea that she was living on a financial life support machine funded entirely by the old man she had just thrown away like garbage. She had the nerve to look me in the eye and call me a freeloader. The irony of her accusation was almost poetic. I moved my cursor directly over the master control switch for the automated financial disbursements. I looked at the long list of connected vendor accounts. The landscaping company, the utility providers, the tax board, the pool maintenance crew. All of them drew their money directly from the corporate holding company I had established decades ago. I took a deep breath. I thought about the sheer disrespect I endured at the dinner table. I thought about my private bank statement being slid across the table like an eviction notice. I thought about Derek looking down at the floor, completely unwilling to defend the father who gave him everything. I placed my finger firmly on the trackpad. I did not hesitate for a single second. I selected the option to immediately terminate all automated property payments. A large warning prompt popped up on the center of the screen asking me to confirm the permanent cancellation of all future disbursements. It warned me in bold text that terminating these specific payments would result in immediate service suspensions and severe financial penalties for the property residents. I clicked confirm. The screen refreshed instantly. The long list of green active statuses suddenly turned a bright, harsh red. Canceled. 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 Every single financial artery feeding their lavish existence was severed in a fraction of a second. The unlimited money tap was shut off permanently. The massive financial bleeding that had quietly drained my accounts for years was finally completely cut. I closed the laptop screen. A quiet plastic click echoed in the small motel room. Brittany was so incredibly proud of her new digital locks. She was so proud of securing the physical doors to the house. But she had absolutely no idea that I had just locked her out of the very financial foundation that kept a solid roof over her head. The silent countdown had officially started. By next week, the utility companies would start sending urgent disconnection notices. By the end of the month, the luxury landscapers would stop showing up entirely. The local tax collectors would start sending aggressive penalty letters addressed directly to Derek. The invisible walls of their beautiful, perfect life were about to cave in on them with crushing weight. And I was going to sit right here, in this cheap motel, drink my bitter black coffee, and quietly watch their entire world come tumbling down. Tuesday morning arrived with a quiet stillness that I had not experienced in a very long time. I was sitting at the small laminate table in my motel room, eating a simple breakfast of oatmeal and black coffee. The sunlight streamed through the thin curtains, casting long shadows across the worn carpet. I felt completely at peace. I knew exactly what was happening on the other side of town. The automated payments I had canceled the night before were just the first layer of the fortress I was dismantling. Brittany thought the battle was over because she had a new lock on a door, but she did not understand that a door means absolutely nothing if the entire house is sinking into the mud. I finished my coffee and opened my laptop. I did not log into the estate portal this time. I logged into my primary commercial banking portal. This was the heavy iron vault that held the true secret of my son's supposed success. 6 years ago, Derek came to me with a rolled-up set of blueprints and a desperate look in his eyes. He wanted to start his own architecture firm, but no bank would give him a business loan. They looked at his lack of experience and his lack of collateral, and they turned him away. So I stepped in. I quietly linked my massive commercial credit line to his new corporate accounts. I became the silent primary guarantor. For 6 years, I absorbed all his financial shocks. When his clients paid late, I covered the payroll. When he wanted to lease a fancy downtown office space to impress people, I co-signed the expensive lease. His firm was a shiny luxury vehicle running entirely on my financial fuel. But today, the fuel tank was going to run completely dry. I clicked on the corporate account management tab. I found his black corporate credit card linked directly to my master account. I submitted the formal digital request to withdraw my signature as the primary guarantor. The banking system asked for a final security confirmation. I pressed the button. The connection was instantly severed. At that exact moment, Derek was sitting on the outdoor terrace of the Whispering Pines Country Club. It was the most exclusive club in the city, a place where the annual membership fees alone cost more than what most working men made in an entire year. Derek did not pay for that membership from his own pocket. The corporate account paid for it. He was hosting a very important lunch meeting with 3 wealthy commercial real estate developers. These were the kind of men Derek desperately wanted to impress. Men who wore custom-tailored suits and drove imported luxury sports cars. Derek was wearing a pristine white linen suit, trying his absolute best to look like he naturally belonged in their wealthy world. He was trying to secure a massive contract to design a new luxury shopping center downtown. He needed this contract desperately, because his firm had not landed a profitable project in over 8 months. He had spent the last hour pitching his grand vision and ordering the most expensive items on the menu to show them he was a highly successful man of means. They ordered prime-aged steaks, imported truffles, and 3 bottles of rare vintage champagne. Derek laughed loudly at their jokes and casually signaled the waiter to keep the expensive drinks flowing. He wanted them to think he was a titan of industry. He wanted them to see him as a man completely in control of his grand destiny. He had absolutely no idea that his destiny had just been formally disconnected by an old man sitting in a cheap motel room eating plain oatmeal. The lunch stretched on for nearly 3 long hours. The developers were thoroughly enjoying the free gourmet meal and the expensive alcohol. They praised Derek for his excellent taste in wine and his grand vision for their future project. Derek was glowing with immense pride. He felt like he had finally reached the absolute pinnacle of high society. He felt like the undisputed king of the world. As the afternoon sun began to dip behind the manicured green golf course, Derek caught the eye of the head waiter and nodded gracefully. It was time to pay the massive bill and seal the lucrative deal. The waiter brought the black leather booklet to the table and placed it softly next to his elbow. The total amount printed on the long receipt was just over $2,000. A staggering amount for a single lunch, but to Derek it was simply the normal cost of doing business. It was an investment in his brilliant future. He confidently reached into the inner pocket of his linen suit jacket and pulled out his heavy metal black corporate credit card. He dropped it onto the small leather tray with a loud, satisfying clink. He did not even bother to look at the detailed bill. He just continued smiling and talking to the wealthy developers about the future of commercial architecture in the growing city. The waiter took the leather booklet and walked discreetly away toward the main dining room registers. Derek leaned back in his comfortable chair, feeling completely victorious. He imagined returning home to his beautiful wife, Brittany, and telling her how he had just secured the biggest contract of his entire career. He imagined the greedy pride shining brightly in her cold eyes. 10 minutes passed slowly. Derek was in the middle of a long story about a recent vacation to Europe when he noticed the head waiter walking back toward the table. The waiter was not alone this time. The club manager, a tall, intimidating man in a dark tailored suit, was walking tightly beside him. They both looked incredibly uncomfortable and extremely serious. The manager approached the table and leaned down, whispering softly into his ear. Derek stopped talking mid-sentence. The confident smile slowly vanished from his handsome face. He quietly asked the manager to please repeat himself. The manager stood up straighter and unfortunately spoke a little too loudly for the quiet terrace. The manager stated clearly that the black corporate card had been completely declined. He said the primary banking institution had placed a hard security freeze on the account and explicitly instructed the merchant to confiscate the physical card immediately. The 3 wealthy developers stopped talking instantly and stared directly at Derek with intense scrutiny. The silence on the luxurious outdoor terrace was suddenly deafening. Derek felt a cold, terrible sweat break out across his forehead. He let out a weak, nervous laugh and told the developers it was just a silly banking error. He told the manager to please run the card one more time. The manager shook his head respectfully but firmly. The manager explained that the terminal had already rejected the transaction 3 separate times and that the account was officially flagged as entirely unauthorized. The manager then asked Derek if he had an alternative form of payment to cover the $2,000 bill. Derek reached frantically into his expensive leather wallet, but his personal debit card was tied to the joint account Brittany had completely emptied just yesterday to pay for her new designer brand inventory. Derek was completely trapped in a nightmare. The developers looked at him with a mixture of profound pity and extreme disgust. In their elite world, there was absolutely no greater sin than portraying immense wealth you did not actually possess. They quietly gathered their expensive leather portfolios, stood up from the table, and coldly thanked Derek for his time. They did not shake his sweating hand. They just walked away, leaving him sitting completely alone with a massive unpaid bill and a confiscated credit card. Derek was silently hyperventilating. He excused himself to the empty table and rushed desperately to the men's restroom. He locked himself inside a private marble stall and pulled out his modern phone with violently trembling hands. He dialed the direct priority access number for his corporate banking representative. The line rang twice before a polite female voice answered. Derek demanded to know immediately why his master corporate card was suddenly declining. He yelled blindly into the phone, telling the representative that he was the chief executive officer of a highly profitable architecture firm and that this ridiculous mistake was costing him massive business deals. The representative calmly placed him on a brief, mandatory hold. The seconds ticked by like heavy lead stones dropping into a dark, empty well. When the representative finally returned to the line, her voice was completely devoid of any customer service emotion. She calmly informed Derek that there was absolutely no technical error in the system. She patiently explained that the primary financial guarantor of the entire corporate account for Mr. Donovan had formally submitted a complete and irrevocable withdrawal of his signature and legal backing earlier that morning. Derek felt all the air leave his lungs in one painful rush. He leaned his dizzy head against the cold, smooth marble wall of the bathroom stall. The representative continued speaking, but her professional words sounded like they were coming from deep underwater. She explained that without the primary guarantor's massive credit line acting as secure collateral, the architecture firm itself did not meet the minimum financial requirements to maintain any corporate accounts. The bank had immediately frozen all attached cards and initiated a standard comprehensive risk assessment audit. She officially informed Derek that the current available balance on his corporate account was now exactly zero. Derek dropped the phone. It clattered loudly onto the tile. He stared blankly at the wooden door. It all came crashing down on him, the crushing realization that his entire life was completely funded by the father he betrayed. He let his arrogant wife destroy the foundation under their feet. Now he was completely alone, forced to somehow pay a $2,000 bill to avoid criminal theft charges. He knew I was the only person who could save him, but he also knew I was never going to answer his phone call. The immediate fallout from the frozen corporate accounts hit the main house like a massive, invisible earthquake. Derek returned home from his humiliating lunch completely empty-handed and utterly broken. He sat on the expensive leather sofa and confessed everything to his wife. He told Brittany that his firm was completely bankrupt and that my financial backing was entirely gone. A normal wife might have comforted her husband in his darkest hour. Brittany was not a normal wife. She did not offer him a single word of sympathy. She immediately began screaming at him, calling him a pathetic, weak loser. She paced furiously across the wide plank oak floors of the massive living room. She realized very quickly that her own lavish lifestyle was now in severe and immediate jeopardy. The automated payments for the estate were already failing. The electricity provider had sent a digital warning notice. She needed a massive influx of cash right away to maintain her image and fund her upcoming lifestyle brand launch. She refused to believe that the money was truly gone. She looked out the large glass window toward the guest house, and her greedy eyes locked onto the detached garage building outside. Inside that garage sat my absolute pride and joy. It was a pristine 1969 Ford Mustang. I had spent countless weekend hours restoring it with my late wife, Rosalind. We rebuilt the engine from scratch and painted the exterior a deep, glossy midnight blue. It was a flawless piece of automotive history worth easily over $80,000 in the current market. Brittany had always hated the car. She thought it was loud and obnoxious, but looking at it now through the window, she only saw a massive stack of easy cash waiting to be taken away quickly. She automatically assumed the car belonged to Derek. She assumed everything on the property belonged to him because he was my only son. She did not bother to ask his permission or verify the paperwork. She took out her phone and snapped a few photographs of the classic vehicle through the garage window. She immediately posted the car on an exclusive online auction board for classic automobile collectors. She listed the asking price at $65,000, hoping for a rapid cash sale. She demanded a cashier check and promised immediate transfer of the vehicle title and keys today. She did not have the keys. She did not have the title. She simply believed she could force Derek to sign whatever paperwork was necessary after the buyer handed over the money. By early Wednesday afternoon, her aggressive online strategy actually worked. A wealthy local car collector saw the listing and recognized the immense value of the pristine vehicle. He contacted Brittany directly and agreed to pay her full asking price in cash today. He told her he was driving over immediately with a heavy-duty flatbed trailer to collect the beautiful classic automobile from the large private estate grounds. Brittany was absolutely thrilled. She walked into the living room and smugly told Derek that she was solving their massive financial problems while he sat around feeling sorry for himself. Derek was too mentally exhausted to even ask what she had done. He just buried his face in his hands. An hour later, a large, heavy-duty pickup truck hauling a professional flatbed trailer pulled through the open wrought iron gates of the estate. A tall, older man wearing a denim jacket and dark sunglasses stepped out of the truck. He was a very serious professional classic car buyer indeed. Brittany walked out to meet him wearing a designer dress and a completely unearned smile of victory. She introduced herself as the owner of the property and led the man directly toward the guest house garage. She told him the car was a family heirloom that they simply did not have space for anymore. The man nodded politely but remained strictly business. He walked around the garage looking through the small glass windows at the beautiful midnight blue paint job. He agreed that the car looked absolutely spectacular from the outside and told her he was ready to buy it. He asked her to open the garage door so he could inspect the engine and verify the paperwork before handing over the heavy envelope of cash. Brittany confidently walked up to the garage door keypad and punched in the standard access code. Nothing happened. The digital pad glowed red. She tried again, punching the numbers harder. The door remained firmly locked. She let out a nervous laugh and told the buyer that the digital system was experiencing a minor technical glitch today. She told him to just wait one moment while she went to find the key inside the house. She hurried back to the main house and frantically searched through drawers trying to find a spare key to the guest house garage. She could not find one anywhere. She stormed back out to the driveway looking extremely frustrated. The buyer was standing near the garage door looking very suspicious. He told her that he could not hand over $65,000 without physically inspecting the vehicle identification number and matching it perfectly to the official legal title. He told her that classic car fraud was a massive problem everywhere, and he never took any foolish chances with money. Brittany waved her hand dismissively and told him he was being completely ridiculous. She pointed to the massive luxury house behind her and loudly asked if she looked like the kind of person who needed to run a cheap scam. The buyer did not care about her fancy dress or her big house. He cared about the law. He walked over to the side window of the garage and pressed his face closely against the glass. He shined a bright tactical flashlight through the window, aiming it directly at the dashboard of the Mustang to read the small numbers clearly. He carefully wrote down the vehicle identification number on a small notepad. He pulled out his phone and opened a professional database application used by licensed car dealers to instantly verify vehicle ownership records. He typed the long string of numbers into the search bar and waited for the official results to load. Brittany stood nearby, tapping her expensive shoes on the concrete driveway, complaining about how long this was taking. The results finally appeared on the bright screen. The buyer stared at his phone for a long moment and then looked up at Brittany with very cold, hard eyes. He asked her very slowly and clearly who exactly owned the beautiful vehicle sitting inside the locked garage. Brittany rolled her eyes and loudly stated that it belonged to her husband, Derek. She said he was sitting inside the main house right now and would sign the title as soon as the cash was handed over. The buyer shook his head slowly. He turned his phone screen around and held it up right in front of her face. The official state database clearly showed that the vehicle was not registered to Derek or any private individual living there at all. The registration document on the screen clearly proved that the vintage Mustang was the exclusive legal property of a private commercial holding company. It belonged entirely to the same corporate limited liability company that I used to control all my major financial assets. Brittany stared at the screen in complete confusion. She had absolutely no idea what the corporate name meant. She loudly insisted that the database was completely wrong and that her husband owned everything on this land. The buyer put his phone back in his pocket and took a large step completely away from her angry face immediately. He told her that attempting to sell a vehicle she did not legally own was a serious felony crime. He told her that he dealt with sophisticated scammers all the time and he was not going to let her steal his hard-earned money. He walked straight back to his heavy truck and climbed into the driver's seat. Brittany yelled at him, demanding he come back and give her the cash envelope. Instead of driving away, the man locked his truck doors and dialed the local police department emergency number. He reported an active, high-value stolen vehicle scam operation. Less than 15 minutes later, 2 police cruisers drove quickly through the open estate gates, their lights flashing brightly against the trees. 2 uniformed officers stepped out and approached Brittany, who was now standing in the driveway looking completely panicked. The car buyer stepped out of his truck and calmly explained the entire situation to the serious officers. He showed them the online listing Brittany had created, and he showed them the official state database proving she had absolutely no legal right to sell the classic car. The officers turned toward Brittany and asked for her identification card right away. They asked her to produce the title for the vehicle she was actively trying to sell online for a massive amount of cash. Brittany started crying uncontrollably. She told the officers that it was just a big misunderstanding. She told them the car belonged to her father-in-law, who used to live in the guest house but was recently evicted. The taller officer looked at her with intense suspicion. He sternly informed her that if she did not own the vehicle and did not have written legal authorization to sell it, she was actively committing criminal attempted grand theft. He told her to put her hands behind her back. She screamed for Derek, who finally ran outside looking completely terrified. Derek begged the officers not to arrest his wife. He admitted to the police that neither of them owned the car or the guest house garage. The officers ultimately decided not to arrest her right then, but they issued a harsh official warning. They told her if she touched anything else she did not own, she would go straight to prison. Standing in the driveway crying, Brittany finally realized she had zero legal authority over anything around her here. The police cruisers finally drove away from the massive estate, leaving behind a heavy and suffocating silence. Brittany stood in the wide paved driveway, watching the red taillights disappear into the dark evening. She was trembling, but it was not from fear or remorse. She was trembling with pure, unadulterated rage. She turned around and marched back into the luxurious main house, slamming the heavy mahogany front door so hard the glass panes rattled in their wooden frames. Derek was sitting on the expensive leather sofa in the living room, holding his head in his shaking hands, looking broken. His architecture firm was entirely bankrupt, and his corporate credit cards were securely locked away in a frozen vault. He had absolutely nothing left to offer her. Brittany stood over him and screamed. She blamed him for the embarrassing incident with the classic car buyer. She blamed him for my actions. She refused to accept any personal responsibility for the absolute disaster unfolding around her. She paced back and forth across the wide plank oak floors, her designer heels clicking sharply against the expensive wood. She needed money immediately to maintain her lavish lifestyle and fund her new lifestyle brand. The electricity provider had already sent a final digital warning notice. The luxury landscaping company had formally suspended their weekly services. The financial walls were rapidly closing in on her perfect world, but she was far too arrogant to simply surrender. She looked out the large living room window and stared directly at the empty guest house, the place I had called home for 3 years. A wicked and desperate idea began to form in her greedy mind. She assumed the failure with the vintage car was just a minor technicality. She believed that even if a corporate company owned the vehicles, Derek must still be the primary legal owner of the physical real estate. After all, he was my only son. In her privileged mind, parents simply handed over their entire fortunes to their children without any legal strings attached. She calculated that the beautiful 2-bedroom guest house could easily be rented out for at least $5,000 a month in their exclusive gated community. That amount of cash would be more than enough to cover her immediate personal expenses and keep her brand afloat, while Derek figured out how to save his failing architecture business quickly. She did not ask Derek for his permission. She did not ask him to review the property deed or consult with a real estate attorney. She simply picked up her modern phone and searched for the most aggressive luxury real estate broker in the entire city. She found a man named Richard who specialized in high-end short-term corporate rentals. She called his office and left a highly demanding voicemail stating she had a premium property available for immediate listing and that she expected him to arrive at the estate first thing Thursday morning. She went to sleep feeling incredibly smug. She honestly thought she had completely outsmarted me. She thought my departure was actually a massive blessing in disguise because it left her with a highly profitable rental property to exploit. Thursday morning arrived with a bright and cheerful sun that completely masked the dark storm brewing over the property. I was sitting at the small laminate desk in my quiet motel room, eating a simple breakfast of scrambled eggs and black coffee. I had my heavy-duty laptop open, and I was monitoring the security cameras through the master estate portal. I watched as a sleek silver luxury sedan pulled up to the front gates of the estate. The gates did not open automatically because I had severed the electrical payment account, but Brittany manually forced them open from the inside. A tall man wearing a sharp-tailored suit stepped out of the silver car holding a leather briefcase. It was Richard, the luxury real estate broker. Brittany walked out to meet him wearing a bright professional dress and her signature fake smile. I turned up the audio feed on the exterior security cameras to listen to their conversation. Brittany confidently introduced herself as the primary owner of the massive 3-acre estate. She shook his hand and immediately began leading him toward the guest house. She pointed out the custom brickwork, the high ceilings, and the expensive windows that I had installed with my own hands. She spoke with extreme authority. She told Richard that she wanted the guest house listed on the private luxury market by the end of the day. She demanded a large upfront security deposit from any potential tenant and insisted on handling all the cash transactions herself. Richard nodded politely, taking careful notes on his digital tablet. He was a seasoned professional who dealt with wealthy, arrogant clients every single day. He knew exactly how to play the game to secure a lucrative commission. Richard walked through the empty guest house, admiring the solid craftsmanship. He complimented the beautiful hardwood floors and the state-of-the-art climate control system. He told Brittany that the property was absolutely stunning and that he could easily find a wealthy corporate executive willing to pay top dollar for such a private and secure location. Brittany beamed with immense pride. She crossed her arms and looked around the empty living room where I used to sit and read my evening newspaper. She loudly proclaimed that getting rid of the old deadweight was the best financial decision she had ever made. She told the broker that she was ready to sign the exclusive listing agreement right there on the kitchen counter. Richard smiled professionally and opened his leather briefcase. He pulled out a stack of crisp legal documents and placed them on the smooth granite surface. He explained that before he could officially list any property on the luxury market, he was legally required to perform a standard public records verification. He needed to confirm the exact legal boundaries of the parcel and verify the registered names on the official county property deed. Brittany waved her hand dismissively and told him to go ahead and run whatever background checks he needed. She confidently stated that the entire estate was owned completely free and clear by her husband, Derek. She leaned against the counter, visualizing the thousands of dollars that would soon be flowing directly into her personal bank account. She was already planning which luxury boutiques she would visit the moment the first rental check cleared. Richard pulled out his mobile phone and accessed the official county tax assessor database. This was a completely public government registry that anyone could view if they simply knew where to look. He typed in the exact street address of the massive estate and waited for the high-speed network to retrieve the official legal documents. The kitchen was completely silent except for the soft hum of the refrigerator. I sat in my motel room miles away, staring at the glowing screen of my laptop, listening to every single breath they took. I took a slow sip of my bitter black coffee. This was the exact moment I had been waiting for. This was the moment the grand illusion was finally going to shatter into a million irreparable pieces. Richard stared at his phone screen for a very long time. His professional smile slowly faded away. He scrolled down the digital page and then scrolled back up, his brow furrowed in deep confusion. He cleared his throat and adjusted his silk tie, looking extremely uncomfortable. He looked up at Brittany, who was still smiling arrogantly. He carefully asked her to spell her husband's full legal name, just to be absolutely certain. Brittany rolled her eyes and spelled Derek's name loudly as if she were speaking to a small child. Richard typed the name into the search bar again to cross-reference the county records. The result remained exactly the same. He slowly placed his phone down on the granite counter and took a deep breath. He looked at Brittany with a mixture of professional pity and extreme awkwardness. He quietly informed her that there must be some kind of massive misunderstanding regarding the legal ownership of the property. Brittany quickly lost her temper. She slammed her hand on the counter and demanded to know what he was talking about. Richard picked up his phone and turned the screen toward her so she could read the official government text herself. He explained in a very calm and steady voice that Derek's name was absolutely nowhere on the property deed. He explained that her name was nowhere on the deed either. He pointed to the registered owner section of the document. The entire 3-acre estate, including the main house, the guest house, the garages, and the beautifully manicured grounds, was legally registered to a private commercial entity. It belonged to an irrevocable trust fund. Richard, being an experienced real estate professional, understood exactly what that meant. He carefully explained to Brittany that an irrevocable trust is a highly secure legal fortress. It cannot be altered, modified, or dissolved by anyone except the primary controlling trustee. He told her that according to the county tax records, the sole controlling trustee of the entire estate was a man named Donovan. He looked at her and asked if she knew who Donovan was. Brittany turned completely pale. All the blood instantly drained from her arrogant face. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. She stared at the name on the screen as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. Richard continued speaking, completely unaware of the massive family war he had just stepped into. He explained that because the property was owned entirely by the irrevocable trust, any person living on the premises without a formal written lease agreement was legally classified as a mere month-to-month tenant at will. He told her she had absolutely zero legal authority to rent the guest house. Her false world completely shattered. She was nothing more than a squatter living inside my property. The eviction clock was finally ticking very loudly now. The rest of Thursday passed in complete and absolute silence. I stayed inside my small motel room watching the dust motes dance in the faded shafts of afternoon sunlight. I knew the revelation at the guest house would send a massive shockwave through their fragile marriage. I knew Brittany was currently tearing the main house apart, looking for someone else to blame for her own extreme arrogance. She would never accept the fact that she was nothing more than a squatter on my land. She would turn all her vicious anger directly toward my son. And I knew that Derek, being the weak man he had chosen to become, would inevitably come crawling to me to fix his massive problems. I did not have to wait long. Friday afternoon arrived with a heavy gray overcast sky that threatened rain. I was sitting at the small laminate desk reviewing the final termination notices from the utility companies when I heard a loud and frantic knocking at my motel room door. It was not a polite knock. It was the desperate pounding of a man who was completely out of options. I slowly stood up from my chair and walked over to the wooden door. I looked through the small scratched peephole. Derek was standing outside on the concrete walkway. He looked absolutely terrible. His expensive designer clothes were wrinkled and unwashed. His hair was completely messy, and he had dark, heavy circles under his bloodshot eyes. He looked like a man who had not slept in days. He looked like a man whose entire fake world was rapidly collapsing, crushing him underneath its massive weight. I reached out and turned the brass deadbolt. I slowly opened the door and stood squarely in the frame. I did not invite him inside. I just looked at him with a completely blank expression. Derek did not greet me. He did not ask how I was doing or apologize for sitting silently while his wife threw me out of my own home on Thanksgiving. He simply pushed his way past my shoulder and stumbled into the small, dingy motel room. He looked around at the cheap furniture and the stained carpet with absolute disgust. Then he turned to face me, his hands trembling wildly at his sides. He started speaking fast, his voice high-pitched and tight with extreme panic. He told me that I had completely ruined his life. He screamed that I had intentionally humiliated Brittany in front of a highly respected luxury real estate broker. He said the broker had spread the story around their wealthy social circle, and now everyone knew they did not actually own the massive estate. He paced back and forth across the small room, waving his arms frantically in the air. He told me that his architecture firm was completely bankrupt because I had maliciously frozen his corporate accounts without any warning. He said his professional reputation was entirely destroyed because his corporate credit card declined at the country club in front of 3 massive commercial developers. He blamed me for every single disaster that was currently destroying his perfect life. He said Brittany was threatening to pack her bags and file for divorce by the end of the week if he did not fix this massive mess immediately. I stood near the door and watched him throw his pathetic temper tantrum. I listened to my only son blame me for the direct consequences of his own terrible choices. He did not take an ounce of personal responsibility for his financial ruin. He honestly believed that I owed him a lifetime of endless protection simply because we shared the same blood. He stopped pacing and stood directly in front of me. His breathing was very heavy and ragged. He looked me right in the eyes and made his ultimate demand. He told me that I needed to call my lawyers right now and legally dissolve the irrevocable trust. He demanded that I sign the deed of the entire 3-acre estate completely over to him and Brittany. He said it was the only possible way to save his failing marriage and restore his broken reputation in the city. He promised that if I gave them the property, they would let me move back into the guest house and live there peacefully until I died. He actually thought he was offering me a very generous and fair compromise. He thought he was giving me a wonderful gift by allowing me to exist quietly in the shadow of my own massive achievements. I did not yell or scream at him. I did not insult his terrible wife or point out the profound hypocrisy of his arrogant demands. I simply walked past him and went to my faded canvas duffel bag resting on the squeaky motel bed. I slowly unzipped the main compartment and reached deeply inside. I quickly bypassed my spare clothes and my shaving kit. I pulled out a very thick, heavy manila folder, tightly bound with 2 thick rubber bands. I had brought this specific folder with me for a very important reason. I absolutely knew this exact confrontation was coming. I slowly turned around and walked back toward Derek. He was watching me with a look of desperate, confused hope. He probably thought I was retrieving the legal trust documents to sign over to him right then and there. He probably thought his angry words had successfully intimidated me into complete submission. I stopped 2 feet away from him and held the heavy folder in my right hand. I looked at his handsome face and saw the exact same entitled expression he had worn since he was a spoiled teenager. I removed the thick rubber bands and opened the manila folder. The folder was absolutely packed with hundreds of printed pages. I pulled out the top document and held it up so he could see the bold black text. It was a commercial invoice from a massive lumber supplier dated 4 years ago. The invoice was for $60,000. I looked directly into his bloodshot eyes and began to speak in a voice as cold and hard as solid concrete. I told him this was the invoice for the building materials he ordered for his very first major architecture project. I reminded him that his client had refused to pay because Derek had completely botched the foundational blueprints. I told him that I paid this massive invoice out of my own retirement savings so he would not be sued for extreme professional negligence and lose his license. I then dropped the printed paper onto the cheap laminate desk. I pulled out another document from the thick stack. It was a formal default notice from a major commercial bank. I showed it to him and explained that this was the severe warning letter he received when he secretly missed 5 consecutive mortgage payments on his expensive downtown office space. I told him I had very quietly wired exactly $80,000 to the bank to save his lease and protect his fragile ego from public humiliation. I slowly dropped that paper onto the desk as well. Then I slowly pulled out a massive stack of bank transfer receipts. I smoothly fanned them out like a deck of playing cards. I told him these were the detailed records of every single time I secretly transferred money into his failing business accounts to cover his basic employee payroll. I told him I did this every single month for the past 3 years, just so he could pretend to be a highly successful chief executive officer in front of his greedy wife. I finally dropped the heavy stack of receipts onto the desk. The sound of the paper hitting the wood echoed loudly in the quiet motel room. Derek stared at the pile of documents with his mouth slightly open. The arrogant anger had completely drained from his pale face, leaving behind nothing but pure, raw shame. He realized in that terrible moment that his entire professional life was nothing more than a carefully constructed illusion, funded entirely by my silent sacrifices. He realized that he was not a self-made titan of industry at all. He was just a small, frightened boy playing dress-up in a very expensive, custom-tailored suit. I closed the empty manila folder and tossed it onto the bed. I looked at my son and felt a deep, profound sadness mixed with absolute finality. I told him that I had spent my entire life building a massive fortress of security to protect him from the harsh realities of the cruel world. I told him I had literally broken my own back and sacrificed my own happiness so he would never have to struggle or feel the painful sting of poverty. But I fully realized right now that my endless protection had completely ruined him. By removing every single obstacle from his path, I had successfully prevented him from ever becoming a real man. I had allowed him to become incredibly soft and weak. And because he was weak, he had allowed an arrogant, selfish woman to completely dominate his life and disrespect the very father who was secretly paying for the food on their fancy table. I told him that the endless stream of silent bailouts was officially over forever. I told him there would be no more secret wire transfers and no more rescued mortgages. I told him that the irrevocable trust was permanently sealed and he would never touch a single blade of grass on that massive estate ever again. I finally told him that his marriage to Brittany was his own terrible mistake to handle. I gathered all the scattered papers from the desk and shoved them aggressively into his trembling hands. He clutched the massive stack of ultimate failures against his chest like a physical shield. Tears began to well up, but I offered no comfort. I gripped his shoulder tightly and steered him directly toward the open door. "You are a grown man now," I said coldly. "Act like it." I pushed him outside and closed the door. The weekend passed with a heavy and ominous silence hanging over the city. I knew my son Derek was sitting in his ruined life crying over his terrible choices. I also knew his wife Brittany was not the kind of woman to simply accept defeat and walk away quietly. She was a cornered animal, and cornered animals always strike out blindly. On Monday morning, I found out exactly how low she was willing to sink to get her hands on my money. I was sitting in my motel room reading the morning newspaper when there was a firm knock on my door. I opened it to find two strangers standing on the concrete walkway. They were not police officers, but they wore official government identification badges clipped to their plain jackets. A middle-aged woman with a stern face introduced herself as a senior caseworker for Adult Protective Services. She was accompanied by a younger man holding a thick clipboard. She looked at me with a mixture of professional concern and deep pity. She informed me that they had received an urgent emergency report regarding my immediate mental capacity and physical safety. I invited them inside my small motel room and offered them the two cheap plastic chairs near the window. I sat on the edge of my bed and calmly asked them to explain the nature of their unexpected visit. The caseworker opened her folder and read from a formal complaint filed late Friday afternoon. The official report claimed that I was suffering from severe and rapidly advancing dementia. It stated that I was experiencing extreme paranoid delusions and that I had wandered away from my secure family home in a state of total mental confusion. The report alleged that I was currently living in a dangerous environment and that I was completely incapable of managing my own financial affairs or making rational decisions. I did not even have to ask who filed the malicious report. I knew it was Brittany. She had realized that she could not legally break the irrevocable trust while I was of sound mind. Her wicked strategy was to have me declared mentally incompetent by the state so she could seize total medical and financial power of attorney. If she succeeded, she would gain absolute control over the massive estate and my commercial accounts. It was a truly evil and highly calculated move. Most elderly people would be completely terrified by this aggressive tactic. They would become angry and defensive when accused of losing their minds. And that is exactly what the state caseworkers look for when evaluating potential dementia patients. If I yelled or threw them out of my room, I would only prove the false allegations right. But I had spent 40 years negotiating with cutthroat commercial contractors and hostile union leaders. I knew how to remain completely cold and composed under extreme pressure. I looked at the caseworker and smiled very politely. I told her that I completely understood her legal obligation to investigate the claims. I spoke in a steady, measured voice using precise vocabulary. I calmly explained that I had recently left the family estate due to a severe financial disagreement with my daughter-in-law and that she was likely retaliating out of pure financial desperation. The caseworker listened carefully, but she stated that the law required me to undergo a comprehensive psychological evaluation to officially close the active case. She told me I had an appointment scheduled for Tuesday morning at the state medical facility. I agreed without a single moment of hesitation. I told them I would be there early. When they left, I locked the door and opened my heavy-duty laptop. I did not waste time feeling sorry for myself. I prepared for the medical evaluation the same way I prepared for a massive corporate audit. I spent the entire afternoon downloading and printing highly detailed financial and personal documents. I compiled a massive binder of undeniable proof of my profound mental clarity. Tuesday morning was bright and clear. I drove my old Ford truck to the large medical building downtown. I walked into the clinical waiting room wearing a tailored wool suit I had bought years ago. I did not look like a confused old man wandering the streets. I looked like a highly successful chief executive officer arriving for a board meeting. A nurse called my name and led me down a long white corridor to a quiet examination room. A senior psychiatrist with gray hair and thick glasses walked in holding the ridiculous complaint filed by Brittany. He sat behind his large desk and looked at me with a very serious and analytical expression. The doctor began asking me standard cognitive questions. He asked me to identify the current president, to spell certain words backwards, and to perform simple mathematical calculations. I answered every single question instantly and flawlessly. But I knew that passing a basic memory test was simply not enough to completely destroy her vicious trap. I needed to absolutely bury her credibility forever. I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out the thick binder I had meticulously prepared the night before. I placed it firmly on the doctor's desk. I told him that I understood my daughter-in-law had claimed I was financially incompetent and mentally confused. I kindly asked him to review the first section of the binder. He opened the cover and his eyes widened slightly. I had provided him with a highly detailed breakdown of my personal stock portfolio. It showed complex daily trades, massive dividend yields, and a flawless track record of strategic market investments over the past 5 years. I explained the intricate tax implications of shifting commercial assets into my irrevocable trust using specific legal terminology that most young lawyers barely understood. I spoke smoothly and confidently. The psychiatrist flipped through the pages with growing amazement. I then directed him to the second section of the heavy binder. It contained my certified state and federal tax returns for the previous 3 years. Every single document was perfectly organized and mathematically flawless. I explained my entire corporate structure, the limited liability companies I managed, and the exact reasons why I had recently severed financial ties with my son Derek. I told the doctor about the massive corporate debt my son carried and the reckless spending habits of his arrogant wife. I painted a very clear and undeniable picture of a greedy woman desperately trying to steal from her own family. The doctor listened intently, taking careful notes on his legal pad. Then I presented my final piece of absolute evidence. 3 weeks prior to this entire family disaster, I had taken a highly advanced cognitive aptitude test for a private senior investment club. It was an official supervised assessment. I slid the sealed results across the desk. The test indicated that my current cognitive function and logical reasoning skills were operating at a documented level consistent with the top 2% of the population. I was legally certified as having a functional genius-level intellect. The old psychiatrist looked up from the official documents and took off his thick glasses. He leaned back in his leather chair and let out a long, heavy sigh. He told me that in his 30 years of medical practice, he had evaluated hundreds of elderly patients for dementia and cognitive decline. He said he usually saw frightened, confused people who desperately needed help. He looked me right in the eye and said that I was probably the most mentally sharp and highly organized individual he had spoken to all year, regardless of age. He closed the manila folder containing Brittany's desperate complaint and tossed it into his outbox with absolute disgust. He apologized to me for the inconvenience and the profound disrespect I had endured. He told me it was a terrible tragedy, how often greedy family members attempted to weaponize the adult protective system to steal money from capable seniors. I thanked him for his time and his professional integrity. I then asked him a very specific and highly strategic question. I asked if he would be willing to document his professional observations regarding the true motivations. I asked him to officially note in my permanent medical record exactly why this false evaluation was requested. The psychiatrist nodded firmly. He picked up his expensive silver pen and began writing a detailed official addendum to his final medical report. He explicitly stated that the patient Donovan demonstrated exceptional mental capacity, superior financial literacy, and pristine psychological health. But he did not stop there. He went on to officially document his expert professional opinion that the complaining party, namely the daughter-in-law, appeared to be entirely motivated by extreme financial distress and malicious manipulative intent. He wrote that the complaint was completely unsubstantiated and highly predatory in nature. This was exactly what I needed. It was an official medical document signed by a state-certified senior psychiatrist legally branding Brittany as a desperate manipulative predator. I politely requested a certified physical copy of this final report for my own personal records. The doctor gladly handed it to me and shook my hand with deep respect. I walked out of the clinical building feeling incredibly powerful. The bright afternoon sun felt warm on my face. Brittany thought she was setting a clever trap to finally lock me away. She thought she could use the government to steal my legacy. She honestly believed I was just a weak old man who would crumble under the terrifying pressure of a state medical investigation. But all she had actually done was hand me the ultimate weapon to completely destroy her in any future legal battle. I climbed back into my reliable old truck and placed the certified medical documents safely inside my heavy leather briefcase. This single piece of paper was more valuable than gold. It was undeniable proof of her immense cruelty and fraudulent behavior. If she ever tried to challenge me in a court of law, this clinical report would absolutely ruin her credibility. The war was no longer just about unpaid bills. She made it personal. The certified medical report sat perfectly flat on the cheap laminate desk of my quiet motel room. It was not just a simple piece of paper. It was a loaded weapon. Brittany had tried to strip away my fundamental human dignity. She had tried to convince the government that I was a confused old man who needed to be locked away in a dark facility. She thought her cruel lies would easily crush me, but she completely underestimated the quiet strength of a man who spent his entire life building strong foundations. I felt absolutely nothing but cold, sharp purpose. I picked up my mobile phone and called the most ruthless property attorney in the city. His name was Marcus, and he was a man who did not care about polite family dynamics or gentle compromises. I had paid him a massive retainer 5 years ago when I originally established the irrevocable trust. I told him everything that had happened over the past week. I told him about the changed locks, the frozen accounts, the attempted car theft, and the malicious medical complaint. Marcus listened silently, and then he simply asked me what exact outcome I wanted to achieve today. I told him I wanted my house back. I told him I wanted the squatters legally removed from my private property. I explicitly instructed Marcus to draft a formal 30-day eviction notice immediately, because the estate was owned entirely by the irrevocable trust, and neither Derek nor Brittany possessed a valid written lease. They were legally classified as month-to-month tenants at will. Furthermore, their unauthorized attempt to sell a registered corporate vehicle and their malicious filing with State Adult Protective Services constituted severe hostile actions against the primary trustee. Marcus assured me the eviction was completely bulletproof. I did not want the legal notice sent quietly through the standard postal service. I wanted it delivered with the exact same level of profound disrespect that Brittany had shown me at the Thanksgiving dinner table. I instructed Marcus to hire a private process server. I wanted the server to wait for the absolute perfect moment to hand her the legal documents. I knew exactly when that moment would be. Brittany was hosting an exclusive dinner party on Friday night to promote her new lifestyle brand to her wealthy social circle. She was completely desperate to maintain her fake illusion. Friday evening arrived with a cool, gentle breeze. I sat comfortably in my motel room and opened the master estate portal on my heavy laptop. The automated utility payments were still canceled, but I had temporarily restored the electrical grid access just enough to let her host her little party. I wanted her to feel incredibly confident right before the floor completely collapsed beneath her feet. I watched the live security camera feeds from the main house. The wide paved driveway was absolutely full of expensive imported luxury cars. The grand dining room was completely packed with elite guests tonight. Brittany was wearing a stunning designer dress and holding a glass of expensive champagne. She was smiling and laughing loudly, acting like the proud queen of a massive empire. Derek was standing quietly in the corner, looking incredibly stressed and drinking heavily. He knew the absolute truth about their catastrophic financial ruin, but he was too cowardly to ruin her perfect evening. He just stood there watching her lie to everyone they knew. The private process server I hired was a tall, muscular man wearing a plain gray delivery uniform. He parked his humble vehicle right outside the massive gates. Because the security gates were currently lacking automated power, he simply pushed the heavy iron doors open and walked straight up the long driveway. He approached the heavy mahogany front doors of the main house and rang the doorbell. Through the security camera audio feed, I could hear the loud chimes echoing inside the grand foyer. Brittany looked annoyed by the sudden interruption, but she confidently walked over to answer the door herself. She probably assumed it was a late caterer or another wealthy guest arriving with an expensive gift. She swung the large wooden door open completely wide indeed. The process server stood on the porch holding a thick manila envelope. He looked directly at her and loudly asked if her name was Brittany. She smiled her arrogant fake smile and proudly confirmed her identity. The server did not smile back. He swiftly pulled a thick stack of legal documents from the envelope and slapped them directly against her chest. She gasped and reflexively grabbed the papers before they could fall to the porch floor. The process server spoke in a very loud, clear voice that easily carried into the silent grand foyer and the crowded dining room area. He formally announced that she was officially being served with a mandatory 30-day notice of absolute eviction on behalf of the irrevocable trust. He clearly stated that she and her husband were legally required to vacate the entire premises immediately due to hostile actions against the property owner. The music inside the house seemed to completely stop. The elite guests suddenly went completely silent. Every single person in the luxurious dining room turned to stare directly at Brittany. The heavy legal papers in her trembling hands were a glaring public confirmation of her absolute, total, and complete massive failure. The process server turned around and walked calmly down the driveway without looking back. Brittany stood completely frozen in the open doorway. Her face turned a bright, angry shade of crimson. The wealthy friends she had desperately tried to impress were now looking at her with extreme pity and profound disgust. They finally realized she was not a successful, wealthy homeowner at all. She was just an arrogant squatter being forcibly removed from a house she did not even own. Derek rushed over to the door and frantically tried to pull her inside to hide from the massive public humiliation. She violently shoved him away and slammed the heavy front door shut. Through the interior security cameras, I watched the entire elite dinner party completely disintegrate. The wealthy guests quickly put their coats on and muttered awkward excuses as they rushed out the back doors to their luxury cars. They did not want to be associated with such a massive, humiliating scandal. Within 20 minutes, the massive main house was completely empty except for Derek and his furious wife. Brittany threw the legal eviction documents across the living room floor and began screaming at the absolute top of her lungs. She blamed Derek for the entire disaster. She screamed that he was a pathetic, weak man who could not even protect his own wife from a crazy old man. Derek just stood there taking the vicious verbal abuse because he had absolutely no spine left. Then Brittany did exactly what I knew she would do. She stormed out of the main house and marched directly across the dark lawn toward the guest house. She was completely consumed by pure blind rage. She reached the front door of the guest house and realized the digital lock code had been entirely disabled. She pounded her small fists against the solid wooden door until her knuckles were bruised and red. She screamed my name into the cold night air, demanding that I come out and face her. She had absolutely no idea that I was miles away, sitting comfortably in a motel room drinking warm tea and watching her complete meltdown on a high-definition monitor. Because she could not get inside the guest house, she began to pace back and forth on the small porch like a trapped wild animal. She looked directly at the front door and began making severe threats. She screamed that she would absolutely never leave the property voluntarily. She yelled that if she was forced to vacate the premises, she would make sure there was absolutely nothing left for me to return to. She threatened to completely destroy the expensive custom woodwork I had built with my own hands. She threatened to smash the large glass windows and tear the expensive copper wiring straight out of the hollow walls. She explicitly promised to burn the entire guest house to the ground before she ever handed the brass keys back to an arrogant old man like me today. She felt incredibly powerful shouting those violent threats into the empty night. She thought her words were completely lost to the wind. She thought she could intimidate me from afar with her destructive promises, but she was entirely ignorant of the massive digital web I had woven around that entire property. When I originally wired the estate, I did not just install cameras pointing outward to watch for external intruders. I also installed highly sensitive hidden microphones and motion-activated recording devices seamlessly integrated into the porch ceilings, the exterior light fixtures, and the main entryways of all buildings there. Every single vicious threat she screamed into the darkness was being recorded in pristine high-definition audio and crystal-clear video. The master estate portal was automatically saving her entire violent confession directly to a secure cloud server. I simply sat at my desk and pressed a single button to download the entire video file to my secure local hard drive. She had just handed me the absolute perfect justification for immediate criminal charges and an emergency restraining order. By threatening to destroy my physical property, she had completely elevated her actions from civil disobedience to a severe criminal felony. I closed the laptop screen and finished my warm tea. Brittany thought she was a highly intelligent manipulator, but she was actually just a loud, reckless fool. She was playing a dangerous game of checkers while I was executing a flawless game of chess. The formal eviction notice was the heavy hammer striking the final nail into her luxurious coffin. I had given them 30 days to leave my property with whatever tiny shred of dignity they had left. But after hearing her violent criminal threats tonight, I knew exactly what my next devastating move was going to be tomorrow. The dark night settled heavily over the silent estate. Inside my small motel room, I sat bathed in the cool blue light of my laptop screen. I watched the live security feed from the main house. The driveway was completely empty now. The wealthy guests had fled the scene of her massive public humiliation. Inside the grand living room, Brittany was pacing like a caged predator. I could see her through the large glass windows. Derek was sitting on the leather sofa with his head buried in his hands. He was completely defeated. But Brittany was entirely consumed by a violent burning rage. She could not accept the reality of the formal eviction notice. She needed to destroy something to feel powerful again. She walked into the kitchen and poured herself another large glass of expensive wine. She drank it quickly. Then, she turned her angry eyes toward the guest house. She remembered the promises she had screamed into the cold night air just an hour ago. She had promised to leave nothing behind for me to return to. She walked out the back door of the main house and marched directly toward the large attached garage. I switched the camera feed to follow her movements. She flipped on the harsh fluorescent garage lights and began tearing through the neatly organized tool benches. She was looking for a weapon. She threw expensive power tools and metal wrenches onto the concrete floor, causing a massive, chaotic mess. Finally, she found exactly what she was searching for. It was a heavy 10-pound steel sledgehammer with a thick wooden handle. Derek had purchased it years ago for a minor landscaping project and never used it again. Brittany grabbed the heavy hammer with both hands. A wicked, terrifying smile spread across her pale face. She dragged the heavy sledgehammer out of the garage and walked across the manicured lawn toward the guest house. The moonlight illuminated her expensive designer dress, which was now dragging through the damp evening grass. She looked absolutely deranged. She marched directly up to the front porch of my guest house. She did not hesitate for a single second. She raised the heavy steel hammer high above her head and swung it violently forward. The solid iron head crashed directly into the beautiful custom glass panel of the front door. The expensive glass shattered instantly, exploding into 1,000 sharp, glittering pieces across the wooden porch. The loud crashing sound echoed through the silent property like a massive gunshot. She swung the heavy hammer again and again, completely destroying the solid mahogany door frame. I sat at my motel desk and watched the violent destruction in stunning high-definition video. I listened to the crisp audio feed as she grunted and cursed with every single destructive swing. The motion sensors on the porch had immediately triggered the emergency recording protocols. Every single frame of her felony crime was being captured and automatically uploaded to my secure cloud server. After completely destroying the front door, she stepped over the broken glass and entered the dark guest house. I quickly switched my laptop view to the interior wide-angle cameras. She walked directly into the main living area. This was the exact room where I had spent countless quiet evenings reading my favorite books. She raised the sledgehammer and smashed it directly into the custom oak fireplace mantel. I had spent 3 entire weeks hand-carving that beautiful oak mantel. It was a piece of true architectural art. The heavy steel hammer cracked the solid wood straight down the middle. Thick splinters flew across the room. Brittany let out a loud, triumphant scream. She moved through the small house like a devastating tornado. She smashed the large bay windows, letting the cold night wind howl into the living room. She swung the hammer into the kitchen counters, cracking the smooth, expensive granite into jagged, broken pieces. She destroyed the stainless steel appliances, denting the refrigerator doors and shattering the glass oven front. She was intentionally trying to inflict as much expensive structural damage as physically possible. She wanted to punish me for daring to take back my own private physical property. She moved down the short hallway toward my bedroom. She swung the heavy hammer into the drywall, leaving massive gaping holes exposing the wooden studs and insulation. She was breathing heavily now, sweating profusely in her ruined designer dress. Her blonde hair was a wild, tangled mess. She walked into my bedroom and completely destroyed the wooden bed frame. She smashed the mirrored closet doors and ripped the custom shelving units right off the painted walls. She spent a full 20 minutes systematically destroying the interior of the very house she had desperately wanted to rent out for extreme profit just yesterday. When she was finally physically exhausted, she dropped the heavy sledgehammer onto the ruined hardwood floor. She stood in the center of the total destruction and laughed a hollow, manic laugh. She truly believed she had won the ultimate victory. She believed she had successfully punished me. She slowly walked out of the ruined guest house and stumbled back across the dark lawn toward the main house. She had absolutely no idea that her violent temper tantrum had just sealed her permanent legal doom. While she was busy swinging the hammer, I was busy compiling the digital evidence. I downloaded the crystal clear video files from the master estate portal. The files showed her face perfectly illuminated by the security lights. The audio captured her screaming her violent intentions and admitting she wanted to destroy my property. The evidence was completely undeniable. It was a textbook case of malicious destruction of property and felony vandalism. I did not wait until morning to take severe action. I opened a secure email window on my laptop and attached the massive high-definition video files. I addressed the urgent message directly to the local police department criminal investigation division. I also included the senior detective who had handled the classic car theft incident just a few days prior. In the body of the email, I formally stated my name and clearly identified myself as the sole legal owner of the estate via the irrevocable trust. I explained that an unauthorized squatter was currently actively destroying the physical structures on my property. I explicitly stated that the total estimated financial damage far exceeded $20,000, making this a highly serious felony offense in our state. I pressed the send button. The heavy digital files flew through the invisible network, landing directly on the police precinct servers. I did not stop there. I picked up my mobile phone and dialed the police emergency dispatch number. A calm female dispatcher answered the line. I spoke in a very clear, steady, and professional voice. I informed her that a violent felony was actively occurring at my registered address. I told her that a female suspect had just used a heavy steel sledgehammer to completely destroy the interior of my guest house. I informed the dispatcher that I had already emailed the live video evidence directly to the precinct detectives. I also clearly warned her that the violent suspect was still on the premises and had ready access to dangerous heavy tools. The dispatcher took my report extremely seriously. She asked me to remain safely at my current off-site location and assured me that multiple patrol units were being dispatched to the massive estate immediately. I thanked her and ended the call. I leaned back in my cheap motel chair and took a deep breath. I turned my attention back to the live security feeds on my laptop. I watched the wide-angle camera pointing down the long paved driveway toward the dark, empty street. I knew the response time in that wealthy, exclusive neighborhood was always incredibly fast. They paid massive city taxes for premium police protection. It was highly ironic that the premium police force was now coming to arrest the woman who falsely claimed to own the neighborhood. Inside the main house, Brittany had returned to the living room. She poured herself another glass of wine and collapsed onto the expensive leather sofa. She was breathing hard and looking completely satisfied with her destructive actions. Derek was standing near the kitchen island, staring at her with a look of absolute sheer terror. He finally realized that he was legally married to a completely unstable and highly dangerous criminal. He tried to ask her what she had done, but she just laughed at him and took a long sip of her dark red wine. Less than 10 minutes after I made the emergency phone call, the quiet neighborhood was completely shattered by the wailing sound of multiple police sirens. Through the security cameras, I watched 3 separate police cruisers speed down the dark street. Their bright red and blue emergency lights flashed violently against the tall oak trees. The heavy vehicles abruptly stopped right outside the iron gates of the estate. The officers quickly exited their vehicles and easily jumped over the decorative stone walls. 2 of them drew their heavy flashlights and immediately approached the ruined guest house to secure the primary crime scene. The other officers marched aggressively up the long driveway toward the main house. Inside, the loud approaching sirens had completely shattered Brittany's smug sense of victory. She jumped up, dropping her expensive wine glass onto the hardwood floor. The glass shattered, spilling red wine everywhere. When she saw the angry police officers marching directly toward her front door, she began to panic entirely. The officers began pounding heavily against the thick wood demanding entry. Brittany backed away in absolute terror, begging Derek to protect her. But Derek stood perfectly still, paralyzed by pure cowardice. He refused to help her. The officers aggressively pushed the heavy door open, rushing into the grand foyer. They grabbed her wrists and forcefully pulled them behind her back, locking heavy steel handcuffs securely into place. Brittany screamed hysterically, crying tears of pure, desperate terror. She yelled for Derek as the police dragged her down the dark driveway, ending her arrogant reign forever. The cold concrete cell of the local police precinct was a massive reality check for a woman who was used to Egyptian cotton sheets and imported champagne. Brittany spent the entire weekend locked inside a holding cell because the senior detective refused to process her bail paperwork until Monday morning. She was forced to wear a bright orange jumpsuit that completely clashed with her expensive designer hairstyle. She sat on a hard metal bench, surrounded by common criminals, completely terrified and shivering in the damp air. She demanded to speak to the chief of police. She threatened to sue the entire city for false imprisonment, but the officers just ignored her loud, arrogant screaming. They had seen the crystal-clear, high-definition video of her swinging a heavy steel sledgehammer into my beautiful custom woodwork. They knew she was a highly dangerous and completely unstable individual. Derek finally managed to scrape together enough cash to post her bail early Monday morning. He had to borrow the money from a distant cousin because his own corporate accounts were completely frozen by my master banking withdrawal. He drove his sleek silver car to the police station and waited quietly in the dingy lobby. When Brittany finally walked out of the heavy steel doors, she did not thank her husband for rescuing her. She did not apologize for completely destroying the guest house or for getting herself arrested on severe felony charges. She immediately began screaming at him for taking so incredibly long to get her out of that disgusting place. She climbed into the passenger seat of his expensive car and aggressively slammed the heavy door. She spent the entire drive back to the estate complaining about the terrible food in the jail and the complete lack of respect she received from the lowly police officers. She told Derek that she was going to hire the most aggressive criminal defense attorney in the entire state and destroy me in a court of law. She honestly believed that this massive disaster was just a minor temporary setback. She was a senior vice president at a highly prestigious public relations firm downtown. Her entire career was built on spinning terrible situations into positive media narratives. She assumed she could easily sweep this entire criminal incident quietly under the rug before anyone important found out about it. But she completely forgot that public arrest records are instantly available on the internet. She forgot that the local news agencies routinely monitor the police dispatch logs for high-profile felony arrests in wealthy, exclusive neighborhoods. And she completely underestimated the sheer speed at which vicious gossip travels in the elite corporate world. Derek dropped her off at the main house so she could shower and change into a fresh designer suit. She told him she was going straight to her corporate office to handle a massive client crisis. She applied thick, expensive makeup to completely hide the dark, exhausted circles under her eyes. She put on her favorite black high heels and drove her luxury sports car downtown. She walked into the massive glass lobby of her prestigious public relations firm, completely expecting everyone to greet her with their usual fake corporate smiles. But the atmosphere inside the sleek, modern office was incredibly cold and entirely hostile. As she walked past the glass conference rooms and the open cubicles, the junior associates immediately stopped talking and stared directly at her. People quickly looked away when she made eye contact. She heard soft, nervous whispers trailing behind her like a dark, heavy shadow. She ignored them and marched proudly toward her large corner office. She thought they were just intimidated by her powerful presence as usual. She sat down at her large, polished mahogany desk and opened her sleek laptop. Before she could even type her password, her desk phone rang loudly. It was the executive assistant for the chief executive officer of the entire firm. The assistant spoke in a very stiff, formal voice and instructed Brittany to report to the top floor boardroom immediately. Brittany smiled to herself. She assumed the chief executive officer wanted her personal advice on a massive new corporate branding campaign. She grabbed her leather portfolio and walked confidently to the private executive elevator. She rode it up to the top floor and walked through the heavy double doors of the massive boardroom. The chief executive officer was an older, very intimidating man who did not tolerate any corporate nonsense. He was sitting at the head of the long glass table looking extremely furious. The head of the corporate human resources department was sitting quietly next to him, holding a thick manila folder. There were no smiles. There were no polite morning greetings. The chief executive officer did not ask her to sit down. He simply reached into the manila folder and pulled out a stack of printed papers. He slid them aggressively across the smooth glass table. Brittany looked down and felt all the blood completely drain from her pale face. The top page was a massive, high-resolution printout of her official police mugshot. Her hair was a tangled, messy disaster, and her mascara was smeared heavily under her angry eyes. Below the humiliating photograph was a detailed article published by a popular local news blog. The bold headline clearly stated that a wealthy public relations executive was arrested for violently destroying a multi-million-dollar estate with a heavy steel sledgehammer. The article detailed the felony vandalism charges and the massive financial damage she had inflicted on the physical property. Brittany started to physically tremble. She quickly tried to use her professional public relations skills to spin the terrible narrative. She stammered and told the chief executive officer that the article was a complete lie fabricated by a crazy old relative. She promised him that she had an aggressive lawyer handling the minor misunderstanding and that the criminal charges would be entirely dropped by the end of the week. The chief executive officer raised his hand to stop her pathetic, desperate lying. He spoke in a cold, ruthless voice that echoed loudly in the massive boardroom. He told her that their firm was paid millions of dollars by high-profile corporate clients to protect their valuable public images. He explained that a senior vice president of public relations absolutely cannot be publicly arrested for a violent felony. He pointed a sharp finger directly at her expensive designer suit and told her she was a massive walking liability. He told her that 3 major corporate clients had already called his private office this morning threatening to cancel their massive contracts because they saw her embarrassing mugshot circulating on social media. The human resources director then calmly opened the official corporate employee handbook and read the strict morality clause aloud. The clause clearly stated that any employee arrested for a violent felony or involved in a severe public scandal would face immediate permanent termination. Brittany began to cry real desperate tears. She begged the chief executive officer for a second chance. She told him about her upcoming lifestyle brand launch and pleaded with him to let her quietly resign instead of being publicly fired. She promised she would issue a formal public apology and check herself into an expensive wellness retreat to fix her public image. But the chief executive officer was completely unmoved by her fake emotional performance. He told her that her access to the corporate building was already completely revoked. He told her that security guards were currently packing up her office belongings into cheap cardboard boxes. He instructed her to hand over her corporate access badge and her company-issued mobile phone immediately. Brittany was entirely stripped of all her massive corporate power in less than 10 minutes. She slowly placed her plastic badge and her sleek phone onto the glass table. She turned around and walked out of the massive boardroom completely humiliated. 2 large security guards escorted her silently to the lobby and watched her walk out the glass doors in absolute disgrace. She drove back to the massive estate in a state of total mental shock. Her prestigious career was entirely destroyed. Her grand lifestyle brand was completely dead before it even officially launched. She was facing severe felony criminal charges that could actually send her to a state prison for several long years. She walked through the front doors of the main house and found Derek sitting in the living room staring blankly at the dark television screen. He looked up at her and instantly knew that something else had gone terribly wrong. Brittany dropped her expensive leather bag onto the hardwood floor and began to scream at him. She channeled all of her massive public humiliation and her deep personal terror directly into pure venomous anger directed entirely at her weak husband. She told him that she was just brutally fired from her prestigious corporate job because of his completely useless crazy father. She blamed Derek for failing to protect her from my brilliant legal traps. She paced frantically back and forth, completely losing her mind. She told him that she needed the absolute best criminal defense team in the entire state to keep her out of a dirty prison cell. She marched directly up to Derek and pointed her sharp manicured finger right into his face. She demanded that he immediately go to his fancy bank and drain every single penny from his highly successful architecture business accounts. She screamed that he was the chief executive officer of $1 million firm and that he had a profound legal duty to pay her massive legal fees right now. She demanded he liquidate all his corporate assets to save her pathetic life. She stood there panting and screaming, completely convinced that Derek was sitting on a massive hidden fortune that could instantly rescue her from total destruction. She had absolutely no idea that his supposed $1 million firm was actually a bankrupt hollow shell. She glared at him, waiting for him to simply nod and agree to her aggressive demands. He just sat there, shivering, completely unable to speak the terrible truth. Derek sat completely still on the expensive leather sofa in the living room while his wife screamed at him. Brittany was pacing back and forth across the hardwood floor, demanding that he immediately secure the most expensive criminal defense attorney in the entire state. She was absolutely terrified of going to a state prison for felony vandalism, but her terror manifested entirely as vicious anger directed at her husband. She yelled that he had a profound legal and moral duty to liquidate his entire architecture firm if necessary to pay her massive legal fees. She pointed her sharp finger at his face and told him to stop feeling sorry for himself and start acting like a real man. Derek felt a crushing physical weight pressing down on his chest. He knew the terrible truth about his failing business, but he was still too afraid to say the words out loud to her. He slowly stood up from the sofa and walked over to his sleek silver laptop resting on the kitchen island. He opened the computer with trembling hands. He knew that I had completely frozen the primary commercial credit lines that kept his business afloat, but he desperately hoped that there was still some operational cash left in his secondary corporate checking accounts. He thought maybe he could scrape together $30,000 or $40,000 to pay the initial retainer fee for a top-tier defense lawyer. It was a pathetic, desperate hope of a man who was entirely out of viable options. He logged into his secure corporate banking portal and stared at the digital dashboard. The main accounts were locked tight, just as the bank representative had informed him days ago. But he clicked on the secondary operational accounts, where client deposits and daily business expenses were historically managed. He expected to see a low balance. He expected to see a struggling company on the absolute brink of total bankruptcy. But what he actually saw made his entire body turn completely numb. The operational balance was not just low, it was aggressively and systematically emptied. Derek leaned closer to the glowing screen, his eyes scanning the long digital columns of recent financial transactions. He clicked on the detailed historical ledger for the past 24 months. He began to scroll down through the extensive pages of corporate financial records. A very dark and highly disturbing pattern immediately emerged from the numbers. Every single month for the past 2 years, a massive sum of money had been quietly transferred out of his corporate operational account. The transfers were always categorized under vague business expenses, like consulting fees or external marketing research. Derek knew exactly who managed the daily bookkeeping for his architecture firm. When he first started the company, he had proudly given Brittany full administrative access to the corporate financial systems, so she could help him manage the growing business. He trusted his beautiful wife implicitly. He had absolutely no reason to suspect that she was silently bleeding his company completely dry. He clicked on the destination routing numbers for the massive monthly transfers. The money was not going to a legitimate corporate vendor or a marketing agency. The funds were being systematically wired directly into a highly secure private offshore account registered in the Cayman Islands. He stared at the screen in total disbelief. The total amount of stolen money was absolutely staggering. Over the course of 24 months, she had secretly siphoned hundreds of thousands of dollars out of his business. This was money that should have been used to pay his hard-working employees or settle his mounting commercial debts. Instead, it was carefully hidden away in a foreign bank account that only she could legally access. The realization hit him like a massive physical blow to the stomach. Brittany was not just spending his money recklessly on expensive clothes and luxury vacations. She was actively and intentionally stealing from him. She had been secretly building a massive financial parachute for herself while leaving his company completely hollow and utterly defenseless against total ruin. Derek felt a sudden sharp pain in his chest as the massive betrayal finally sank into his mind. He looked up from the glowing laptop screen and stared at his wife. She was standing near the broken kitchen counter, still complaining loudly about the terrible smell of the local police precinct holding cell. She was completely oblivious to the massive digital evidence of her profound criminal betrayal currently glowing on the screen behind her. Derek slowly turned the laptop around so the screen was facing her directly. He did not scream or yell. His voice was completely hollow and entirely broken. He asked her to look at the screen and explain the massive offshore wire transfers. Brittany stopped talking mid-sentence. She looked at the laptop screen, and then she looked directly into his red bloodshot eyes. For a brief second, he expected her to deny it. He expected her to invent a frantic, desperate lie about a secret corporate investment strategy or a hidden savings account for their future children. But Brittany did not lie. She did not cry or beg for his forgiveness. Her face became completely cold and entirely expressionless. The mask of the loving, supportive wife completely fell away, revealing the ruthless, calculating predator hiding underneath. She casually walked over to the kitchen island and poured herself a fresh glass of expensive red wine. She took a slow, deliberate sip before she finally answered him. She told him that she was not a stupid woman. She said she had realized 2 years ago that his massive architecture firm was actually a complete financial failure. She told him she had secretly looked at the primary corporate accounting ledgers and discovered that his entire successful lifestyle was actually being secretly funded by his wealthy father. She looked at him with absolute profound disgust and stated that she refused to go down with a sinking ship. She admitted that she had been quietly moving the money into a private international account to protect her own future. Derek stood there completely paralyzed by her cold and calculating words. He asked her how she could possibly do something so incredibly evil to the man she promised to love and protect forever. Brittany just laughed, a harsh, cruel laugh that echoed loudly in the ruined kitchen. She told him that love was a luxury for wealthy people who actually own their own money. She said she had married a highly successful chief executive officer who promised her a life of ultimate luxury and supreme social status. She told him she never agreed to marry a weak, pathetic little boy who still desperately needed his daddy to pay for his fancy suits and his expensive country club memberships. She said she lost every single ounce of basic human respect for him the very moment she realized he was just a total financial fraud. She admitted that she was planning to leave him next month, right after her massive lifestyle brand officially launched. She said she was only staying in the marriage long enough to extract the last remaining drops of absolute financial value from his failing business. Derek felt sick to his stomach. The woman he had defended against his own father, the woman he had completely sacrificed his own flesh and blood to keep happy, had been plotting to abandon him for years. She had used his blind loyalty as a convenient shield while she quietly robbed him entirely blind. He took a step back from her as if she were a highly venomous snake preparing to strike again. He told her she was a total monster. He said she was a deeply wicked person who destroyed everything she ever touched. Brittany did not care about his insults. She was completely devoid of any human empathy or basic moral conscience. She set her wine glass down on the counter and looked at him with eyes as cold as solid winter ice. She told him his pathetic tears meant absolutely nothing to her now. She crossed her arms over her chest and stood perfectly straight. She told him that since the ugly truth was finally out in the open, there was absolutely no reason to continue playing this pathetic domestic game anymore. She formally stated that she was officially done with him and his completely ruined life. She said he was a miserable failure who could not even afford to hire a decent lawyer to keep his own wife out of a dirty prison cell. Derek stared at her in complete silence. The profound, absolute devastation of his entire existence was finally complete. He had lost his father, he had lost his business, and now he had completely lost the cruel woman he threw it all away for. But Brittany was not finished destroying him yet. She looked at him and delivered her final crushing demand with a completely straight face. She told him she was contacting a ruthless divorce attorney first thing tomorrow morning. She said she did not care that the corporate accounts were frozen or that he was currently drowning in massive commercial debt. She confidently stated that she was legally entitled to exactly half of everything he owned. She looked at the broken man standing in the ruined kitchen and demanded a divorce and half of his $1 million firm. She honestly believed she was about to walk away a very rich woman, leaving him completely with nothing. But she had absolutely no idea what half of his $1 million firm actually meant on paper. The tragic reality of his situation was that his entire company was essentially a massive empty void of extreme commercial debt wrapped in a very shiny fake experience. He stood there completely unable to speak, looking at the woman who had just ruined his entire world. She picked up her glass of wine and walked past him without a single trace of pity or remorse. She went upstairs to pack her expensive designer bags, leaving him completely alone in the shattered remains of the fake life he had so desperately tried to maintain. The rain was falling heavily against the cheap glass window of my small motel room. It was Tuesday evening and the sky was a deep shade of bruised purple. I sat in the single comfortable chair the room provided, watching the water trace long, slow paths down the pane. The world outside looked exactly how my son must be feeling right now. Completely gray, washed out, and entirely devoid of any residual warmth. I knew he was coming. It was only a matter of time before the crushing weight of his ruined life forced him to seek my shelter today. The knock on the wooden door was not aggressive or demanding like the last time he visited. It was a weak, hesitant sound. It was the knock of a completely broken man who had finally realized the massive extent of his own pathetic cowardice. I stood up slowly and walked across the stained carpet. I turned the brass lock and pulled the heavy door open. Derek stood on the concrete walkway, completely soaked by the freezing rain. He was not wearing his expensive, custom-tailored suits tonight. He was wearing a plain gray hooded sweatshirt and wrinkled denim blue jeans. He looked like a frightened little boy who had just woken up from a terrible nightmare. His hair was plastered to his wet forehead, and his eyes were completely red from crying. He shivered violently in the cold wind, looking at me with a pathetic expression of profound, absolute desperation. I stepped back and allowed him to enter the small, dim room. He walked past me, leaving a trail of dripping water on the faded carpet. I closed the door, shutting out the howling wind and the freezing rain. Derek collapsed onto the edge of the squeaky motel spring bed. He buried his wet face in his trembling hands and began to sob uncontrollably. It was a deep, agonizing sound, the sound of a man mourning the sudden, violent death of his entire fake existence. I did not rush to comfort him. I did not place a warm, reassuring hand on his shaking shoulder. I simply walked over to the small laminate desk and stood there watching him cry. I had shed all my tears for him many years ago when I first realized he was choosing an arrogant predator over his own flesh and blood. He wept very loudly. He cried for 10 solid minutes before he could finally speak. His voice was cracked and completely hoarse. He looked up at me with tears streaming down his face and began to confess everything. He told me about the massive offshore accounts Brittany had secretly opened in the Cayman Islands. He explained how she had been quietly siphoning hundreds of thousands of dollars from his corporate operational funds for the past 2 years. He confessed that his architecture firm was completely hollowed out and entirely bankrupt. He told me about the vicious argument in the ruined kitchen earlier that evening. He repeated the cruel, heartless words she had said to him. He told me she admitted she never loved him and only stayed to steal his money. He explained that she was formally demanding a divorce and aggressively seeking half of his entire firm and all his personal assets in the upcoming legal settlement. Derek wiped his wet face with the sleeve of his gray sweatshirt. He looked at me with a desperate, pleading gaze. He told me he was completely ruined. He said Brittany was going to hire the most ruthless divorce attorneys in the state right away tomorrow. He explained that because his corporate accounts were frozen, he had absolutely no money to retain his own legal counsel. He said she was going to take everything he had ever worked for and leave him with massive, crushing debt. Then he did exactly what I expected him to do. He begged me for a massive financial bailout. He asked me to unlock the commercial credit lines just long enough for him to hire a team of elite corporate lawyers. He begged me to help him fight her in court so he could save his architecture firm and professional reputation. He sat on the bed rambling frantically about legal strategies and asset protection. He told me that we had to protect our family legacy from her greedy hands. He used the word we as if we were equal partners in this massive disaster. He honestly believed that the deep bond of blood would automatically force me to rescue him from the terrible consequences of his own blind loyalty to her. He thought I would be so angry at Brittany for stealing from my son that I would immediately open my heavy iron vault and fund his legal war against her. He looked at me, waiting for the familiar, comforting promise that everything was going to be completely fine. He waited for the soft, paternal reassurance that I would handle the massive problem for him just like I had always done in the past. But he was speaking to a father who no longer existed. I turned away from him and opened the small cabinet above the desk. I reached inside and pulled out a heavy crystal bottle of premium bourbon I had purchased earlier that day. I also took out a single heavy glass tumbler and unscrewed the cork top. I slowly poured a generous measure of the dark amber liquid into the glass. The rich smell of the aged bourbon filled the small motel room. I did not offer Derek a drink. He needed absolute clarity right now, not the comforting, numb haze of alcohol. I took a slow, deliberate sip, feeling the pleasant burn slide down my throat. I turned back around and looked down at my completely broken son. I let the silence stretch out between us for a very long time. I wanted him to feel the heavy crushing weight of his absolute massive failure completely. I spoke in a voice that was perfectly calm and entirely devoid of any warm emotion. I told him he was completely delusional if he thought I was going to give him a single dime to fight this battle. Derek looked at me in total shock. His mouth opened, but he could not find any words. I took another slow sip of my bourbon and began to explain exactly why he was going to face this massive disaster completely alone. I reminded him of the absolute immense struggles I endured to build my massive commercial empire from the dirty ground. I told him about the long, back-breaking years I spent crawling through dark, dusty ventilation shafts and hauling heavy metal pipes up endless flights of stairs. I reminded him of the extreme physical pain and the bitter racial prejudice I quietly swallowed every single day so he could live a comfortable life. I told him he had absolutely no idea what it meant to be a black man building a legitimate corporate fortress in a world entirely designed to keep him mopping dirty floors. I explained that every single dollar in my massive bank accounts represented my own blood entirely. I told him I built that massive estate and funded his luxurious lifestyle so he could be a strong, independent man. But instead of respecting that profound, massive sacrifice, he took it completely for granted. I told him he allowed a greedy, arrogant woman to sit at my own dinner table and disrespect me right to my face. I reminded him of the Thanksgiving dinner where she threw my bank statement across the table and called me a pathetic freeloader. I pointed a steady finger directly at his face and reminded him of his silent cowardice during that painful evening. I told him that when she disrespected me, she was disrespecting the entire painful history of my life. She was spitting on the very foundation that kept his soft hands completely clean. And he just sat there looking at his expensive shoes, silently agreeing with her vicious, cruel words. I told him he chose her over the father who gave him absolutely everything. He chose the fake illusion of a perfect, wealthy marriage over the solid, reliable truth of his own bloodline. I told him he let her lock me out of my own property with absolutely zero hesitation then. He let her try to steal my classic vintage car. He let her file a malicious government report trying to lock me in a psychiatric hospital forever. I told him he was fully complicit in every single evil action she took because he was simply too weak to stand up and tell her no. Derek began to cry again, shaking his head frantically. He told me he was just trying to keep the peace in his marriage. He said he was absolutely terrified of losing her, and he did not know how to stop her aggressive and completely destructive behavior. I looked at him with profound disgust. I told him that keeping the peace by sacrificing your own father is not a virtue, it is the ultimate absolute betrayal. I told him a real man protects his family from predators. He does not invite the predator into the house and hand her the keys to the heavy iron vault. I took another sip of bourbon and let the cold, hard reality sink into his mind. I told him that his architecture firm was never a real successful business. It was just an expensive hobby that I quietly funded for him. I explained that the money Brittany stole from his corporate accounts was not actually his money. It was my money. She had successfully stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars of my hard-earned wealth because he was too incompetent to monitor his own accounting ledgers. I told him that his massive million-dollar firm was nothing more than a giant empty shell filled with crushing commercial debt. I refused to give him a single cent for his legal fees. He was not getting any corporate lawyers. He was completely abandoned. The firm is entirely on its own from now on. The 30 days passed with an agonizingly slow and heavy rhythm. I remained in my small motel room, watching the days cross off the calendar one by one. I did not return to the massive estate. I did not call my son Derek, and I certainly did not answer any of the frantic messages left by his soon-to-be ex-wife. I gave them exactly 1 month to quietly pack their belongings and leave my physical property with whatever small shred of dignity they had remaining. I secretly hoped that Derek would finally find a backbone and hire a moving truck to quietly exit the premises under the cover of darkness. But cowardly men do not suddenly become brave simply because the clock is loudly ticking down to zero. They freeze in the face of inevitable consequences. They close their eyes and blindly hope the massive approaching storm will miraculously change direction. The storm did not change direction. It arrived precisely on schedule early Friday morning. The official eviction day began with a cold, thick fog rolling across the manicured lawns of the exclusive, gated community. I opened my heavy laptop and logged into the master estate security portal for the final time. I sat back in my cheap motel chair and watched the live camera feeds with a completely cold and detached heart. At exactly 8:00 in the morning, a line of heavy vehicles turned onto the long paved driveway. Leading the procession were two large black and white police cruisers from the county sheriff department. Directly behind them was a massive white moving truck operated by a private eviction crew my ruthless property lawyer had hired. The heavy tires crunched loudly against the gravel, completely shattering the quiet morning peace. The sheriff deputies stepped out of their vehicles wearing thick, dark uniforms and heavy-duty utility belts. They walked directly up to the grand mahogany front doors of the main house and began pounding heavily with their fists. The loud, hollow sound echoed across the entire property. Inside the main house, the security cameras showed a scene of absolute total chaos. Brittany had not packed a single cardboard box. She was sitting in the middle of the expensive living room, surrounded by her luxury designer clothes and premium leather handbags. She actually believed her arrogant attitude could somehow legally stop a court-ordered eviction process. She believed the rules of normal society simply did not apply to a wealthy public relations executive like her. When the deputies forcefully pushed the unlocked front door open and stepped into the grand foyer, she immediately began screaming at them. She demanded to see their supervisor and threatened to sue the entire police department for unlawful entry. The senior deputy did not even flinch. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man who had dealt with hundreds of delusional squatters throughout his long career. He calmly pulled the formal court order from his clipboard and held it up for her to clearly read. He informed her that the 30-day legal grace period was officially over. He told her she had exactly 5 minutes to gather her essential personal items and permanently vacate the premises before she would be physically removed and arrested for criminal trespassing. Derek was standing in the kitchen wearing the same wrinkled gray sweatshirt from the night he begged me for money. He looked completely numb. He did not say a single word as the private eviction crew flooded into the massive house. These men were not gentle, expensive movers, hired to carefully wrap fragile items in thick bubble wrap. They were a rapid eviction team paid to clear the physical property as fast as legally possible. They grabbed heavy armfuls of expensive silk clothing, designer shoes, and imported luxury cosmetics. They marched right past Brittany and carried everything straight out the front door. They did not gently place the items into the moving truck. The legal eviction protocol required all personal property to be immediately deposited on the closest public right-of-way. That meant her entire lavish lifestyle was being unceremoniously dumped directly onto the damp front lawn for the entire world to see. Brittany ran outside, screaming hysterically, as the burly men tossed her expensive velvet chairs and her custom glass coffee tables onto the wet grass. She tried to grab a heavy designer dress out of a mover's hands, but the deputy quickly stepped in and warned her to step back immediately. The pile of luxury goods on the front lawn grew larger and more chaotic by the minute. Expensive Italian leather boots were buried under stacks of fancy kitchen appliances and completely ruined silk bed sheets. The beautiful, pristine yard I had spent thousands of dollars landscaping was now completely covered in the pathetic physical wreckage of her massive arrogance. The loud commotion inevitably drew the intense attention of the entire wealthy neighborhood. In an exclusive gated community, absolute privacy is the ultimate luxury. Public disturbances are considered the highest form of social disgrace. The massive wooden doors of the neighboring mansions slowly opened. Wealthy doctors, corporate executives, and elite socialites walked out onto their expansive driveways in their expensive morning robes to watch the incredible spectacle unfolding next door. They saw the flashing lights of the sheriff cruisers. They saw the massive pile of expensive garbage covering the pristine lawn. And they saw Brittany running around in a frantic panic, completely humiliated in the bright morning light. A few of the younger neighbors actually pulled out their modern mobile phones and began recording high-definition videos of the entire pathetic scene. The woman who had proudly hosted a massive elite dinner party just 1 month ago was now the starring attraction of a humiliating neighborhood freak show. Her fake empire of ultimate luxury and supreme social status was being broadcast across the internet in real time. She noticed the glowing camera lenses pointed directly at her and completely lost her remaining sanity. She ran toward the wrought iron gate, screaming vicious obscenities at her former wealthy friends. She yelled that they were all fake, pathetic hypocrites. But her loud, angry words only made the public humiliation infinitely worse. The neighbors simply whispered to each other and continued recording her massive historical meltdown. Brittany realized she had absolutely no power left to stop the total destruction of her perfect image. She turned around and marched back up the driveway, stomping her expensive heels into the wet grass. The eviction crew was already pulling the heavy mahogany front doors shut and installing heavy steel padlocks on the exterior handles. The house was officially sealed. Derek was standing quietly near the edge of the driveway, holding a single, small canvas duffel bag containing his few remaining personal items. He looked like a completely broken, empty shell of a human being. He watched his furious wife approach him and visibly braced himself for the inevitable violent impact. Brittany stopped exactly 2 feet away from him. She was breathing heavily, her face completely flushed with pure, venomous anger. Her expensive clothes were stained with mud, and her blonde hair was completely ruined by the thick morning fog. She looked at him with an expression of such profound, absolute disgust that it almost radiated through the digital security feed straight into my quiet motel room. She did not offer him any comfort. She did not suggest that they find a cheap hotel and figure out a new plan together. She completely blamed him for every single terrible thing that had happened to her today. She pointed a sharp shaking finger directly at his chest and began to speak in a loud, cruel voice that carried perfectly over the cool morning air. She told him he was the most pathetic, useless man she had ever met in her entire life. She yelled that he had promised her a life of endless luxury but had only delivered massive public humiliation and complete financial ruin. She reminded him that she had just been forcefully dragged out of a house she thought she owned because his crazy old father was a deeply vindictive monster. She screamed that she had wasted the best, beautiful years of her life pretending to respect a weak little boy who could not even protect his own wife from a standard legal eviction. Derek simply stared at the wet pavement, completely unable to defend himself against her vicious, truthful words. Then Brittany delivered her ultimate final blow. She stood perfectly straight and smoothed the wrinkles from her dirty designer coat. She crossed her arms and looked down at him with an arrogant, triumphant sneer. She loudly declared that she was completely done playing this miserable, pathetic game with him. She formally announced that she had already scheduled an urgent meeting with the most aggressive, expensive divorce attorney in the city for that very afternoon. She told him she was going to legally destroy him in family court. She smiled a cold, wicked smile and explicitly promised that she was going to fight for exactly half of his highly successful million-dollar architecture firm. She said she was going to legally force him to liquidate every single corporate asset he owned to pay for her massive pain and extreme emotional suffering. She told him he would be completely bankrupt and working at a cheap fast food restaurant for the rest of his miserable life by the time her elite lawyers were finally finished bleeding him dry. Derek looked up at her and his face turned a sickening shade of pale green. He looked physically ill. His hands began to tremble, violently holding the strap of his cheap canvas duffel bag. Brittany thought his extreme physical reaction was simply out of pure, terrible fear of losing his successful business to her. She thought she had completely terrified him with her aggressive legal threats. She turned around and proudly marched down the long paved driveway, leaving him standing completely alone in the cold morning fog. She walked right out of the iron gates and hailed a passing taxicab without ever looking back at the man she had just completely destroyed. I sat in my motel room and took a slow, deep breath. I closed the heavy laptop screen and listened to the quiet hum of the cheap air conditioner. Brittany honestly believed she had just dealt the absolute ultimate winning hand in this massive, dangerous game. She thought she was going to walk into a luxury divorce court and walk out a very wealthy, independent woman. She thought she was taking half of a massive, glowing treasure chest. But I knew the absolute brilliant truth. She was completely oblivious to the massive, terrifying financial reality she was about to forcefully uncover. By aggressively demanding half of his million-dollar architecture firm, she was legally tying herself to a massive sinking ship made entirely of solid lead. She did not know that the firm was entirely propped up by a massive commercial loan from my private corporate holding company. She did not know that by taking half of his business assets, she was legally volunteering to take on half of a massive, staggering commercial debt that would completely ruin her entire life forever. The divorce mediation took place 2 weeks later in a cold, sterile conference room downtown. The room was located on the 40th floor of a massive glass skyscraper. It was exactly the kind of expensive corporate environment where Brittany felt most powerful. She sat at the long, polished mahogany table wearing a brand new designer suit she had probably purchased with the last remaining dollars on her personal credit cards. She looked incredibly smug and completely triumphant. She honestly believed that the legal system was simply a magical machine designed to reward her for her massive arrogance and greed today. Derek sat across from her looking like a completely empty shell of a human being. He wore a cheap, wrinkled suit and stared blankly at the legal notepad scattered in front of him. He did not even hire a lawyer to represent him. He simply could not afford one. He was facing a vicious legal execution completely alone and entirely unarmed. Sitting next to Brittany was her highly expensive and incredibly aggressive divorce attorney. He was a man with slicked back hair and a very sharp, expensive tie. He opened his thick leather briefcase and pulled out some legal documents. He cleared his throat and began speaking in a loud, booming voice that was entirely designed to intimidate my weak son. The lawyer proudly announced that they were gathered today to facilitate a fair and equitable distribution of the marital assets. He smiled a very cold and predatory smile. He looked directly at Derek and stated that his client was fully prepared to take exactly 50% of everything Derek owned. The lawyer then laid out his absolutely ridiculous financial estimations. He confidently claimed that the architecture firm was currently valued at a minimum of $3 million totally outright. He cited the expensive downtown office lease, the high-profile corporate clients, and the massive estate they had recently occupied as absolute proof of the incredible wealth the business generated. Brittany leaned back in her plush leather chair and crossed her arms. She looked at Derek with pure, unadulterated contempt. She told him that she built that company right alongside him, and she deserved her fair share of the massive profits. She demanded $1,500,000 in immediate liquid cash to settle her portion of the corporate assets. She also demanded permanent spousal support forever, right now. She sat there visualizing the massive piles of money she was about to receive. She thought she was going to walk out of that cold conference room an incredibly wealthy, independent woman. She thought she had successfully manipulated the entire legal system to secure her perfect financial future. Derek just sat there listening to the absurd numbers. He slowly opened his mouth to try and explain that the firm was actually completely bankrupt. He tried to tell her that there was absolutely no money left to give her. But before Derek could even form a complete sentence, the doors opened. The heavy glass doors of the conference room swung open widely. The mediation mediator, a quiet older man, looked up in total surprise. Brittany frowned, and her expensive lawyer immediately stood up to loudly object to the sudden intrusion. But the man walking into the room did not care about their objections. It was Marcus, my ruthless property and corporate attorney. He was wearing an immaculate dark charcoal suit and carrying a very thick, heavy black leather briefcase. He walked with the calm, terrifying confidence of a man who held all the winning cards perfectly secure in his own hands. Marcus did not look at Derek or the mediator. He looked directly at the aggressive lawyer representing Brittany. Marcus calmly pulled out a single wooden chair and sat down at the very end of the long, polished table. He placed his heavy briefcase on the smooth surface and clicked the brass locks open. The loud metallic clicks echoed sharply in the completely silent room. Brittany's lawyer demanded to know who this man was and why he was interrupting a private legal divorce mediation. Marcus did not raise his voice. He spoke in a very smooth, highly professional tone, commanding respect. He formally introduced himself as the primary legal counsel representing a private commercial holding company. He stated that his client was the single largest corporate creditor of the architecture firm currently being discussed. Brittany let out a loud, arrogant laugh. She told Marcus that her husband owned the firm completely free and clear and that there were no massive corporate creditors. She told Marcus to get out of the room before she called the building security to forcefully remove him. Marcus completely ignored her pathetic threats. He reached into his thick briefcase and pulled out a massive stack of papers. These were certified, audited financial records. These were not the fake, optimistic ledgers Derek had used to pretend he was wealthy. These were the true underlying financial documents of the entire corporate structure. Marcus slid the heavy stack of papers straight down the long table until they stopped directly in front of Brittany's highly expensive lawyer. Marcus calmly advised the opposing counsel to closely review the certified corporate loan documents before making any more ridiculous demands for millions of dollars. The slick lawyer picked up the top document and began to carefully read the text. The arrogant confidence vanished completely. As his eyes scanned the dense legal text, the arrogant confidence completely vanished from his sharp face. He flipped to the second page and then the third, his hands beginning to tremble slightly. Brittany noticed her lawyer's sudden panic and sharply asked him what the document said. The lawyer swallowed hard and looked at her with a very grim and completely terrified expression. He slowly explained the absolute devastating reality of her current legal situation. He told her that the architecture firm did not actually belong to Derek outright. The firm had been massively financed from the very first day. It was financed by a highly complex corporate loan originated by my limited liability company. Marcus leaned forward and confirmed the lawyer's terrible discovery. Marcus explained that my holding company had legally provided exactly $1,500,000 in direct operational capital to keep the architecture firm afloat over the past 6 years. Marcus then handed over the second stack of certified documents. He explained that these documents represented the current liquid assets of the architecture firm. He pointed out that over the past 2 years, massive amounts of operational cash had been systematically drained from corporate accounts. This cash was secretly wired into private offshore bank accounts in the Cayman Islands. Brittany turned completely white. She realized that Marcus and I knew absolutely everything about her secret, illegal theft. Marcus continued his brutal financial presentation. He explained that because the liquid cash was entirely gone, the architecture firm currently possessed a net value that was severely negative. The firm owned absolutely nothing except a few cheap computers, a broken office lease, and a massive staggering debt to my private holding company. Marcus looked directly at Brittany and smiled a very cold, calculated smile meant to terrify her. He told her that she was absolutely correct to demand exactly 50% of the marital corporate assets. But he gently reminded her that under the strict laws of this state, taking half of the marital assets also legally required taking exactly half of the marital corporate debt. Brittany could not comprehend the words. Her brain simply refused to accept the massive, terrifying reality crashing down upon her. She began stammering and shaking her head frantically. She told Marcus that she only wanted half of the profits, and that she was absolutely not responsible for her husband's terrible business debts. Marcus opened a large leather-bound law book and read the specific state statutes aloud in a very clear, steady voice. He explained that because she had been legally married to the chief executive officer and had actively participated in the corporate bookkeeping, she was absolutely legally liable for exactly 50% of the massive commercial loan. Marcus looked at her expensive lawyer and handed him the final formal demand letter. The letter explicitly stated that upon the finalization of the divorce settlement, Brittany would be legally forced to assume exactly $750,000 of corporate debt. Because her husband was entirely bankrupt, my holding company would immediately begin aggressive collection efforts directly against her personal future income to satisfy her massive portion of the loan. The silence in the cold corporate conference room was incredibly heavy. It felt like all the oxygen had been completely sucked out of the room. Derek sat perfectly still, staring at the polished table. He finally understood the absolute brilliant magnitude of my silent adjustment. He realized that I had not simply abandoned him to be destroyed by a greedy predator. I had intentionally allowed her to aggressively demand half today. I wanted her to demand half of his hollow empire so she would legally chain herself to a massive, inescapable anchor of crushing debt. Brittany stood up from her plush leather chair, her knees trembling so violently she could barely stand. She looked at her highly expensive lawyer and begged him to tell her this was all a terrible legal mistake. She pleaded with him to find a massive loophole to save her from total financial ruin. But her lawyer just slowly shook his head and closed his legal notepad. He realized he was never going to get paid fees. He looked at Brittany and told her the financial documents were completely bulletproof. He told her that she had demanded half of everything, and now she was getting exactly what she asked for. She was getting half of a totally bankrupt company and a massive crippling debt that would legally follow her for the rest of her miserable life. Brittany let out a loud, agonizing scream. It was the sound of pure, absolute despair. She had spent years manipulating, stealing, and destroying everything around her to build a perfect, wealthy life. She thought she had completely outsmarted me. I won. The formal family court hearing took place exactly 3 weeks after the disastrous mediation session. The downtown courtroom was a massive space filled with dark, polished mahogany wood and cold, white marble floors. It was not a place for loud, arrogant arguments or fake corporate posturing. It was a serious environment where absolute truth was measured entirely in black ink and legally binding signatures. I sat in the heavy wooden gallery benches at the very back of the quiet room. I wore my best charcoal wool suit and sat perfectly still. I did not want to draw any unnecessary attention to myself. Marcus, my highly aggressive corporate attorney, sat confidently at the front plaintiff's table representing my private commercial holding company. He opened his thick leather briefcase and arranged his certified financial documents into neat, perfect stacks. He looked completely relaxed and entirely prepared to absolutely destroy her fake, luxurious reality. Derek sat at the respondent's table looking like a completely hollow shell of a human being. He wore the exact same cheap, wrinkled suit he had worn to the terrible mediation section. He stared blankly at the dark wooden table, completely ignoring the heavy legal notepads scattered in front of him. He looked like a defeated man walking directly toward a violent public execution. Brittany sat on the opposite side of the wide center aisle with her highly expensive divorce attorney. She had spent the last 3 weeks frantically trying to find a massive legal loophole to save her from total financial ruin. She wore a severe black designer dress and sat with her thin arms tightly crossed over her chest. She was desperately trying to project an aura of supreme confident power, but I could clearly see the tiny, nervous tremors violently shaking her manicured hands. She was absolutely terrified, but she was simply too arrogant to ever admit total defeat. The honorable judge entered the quiet courtroom from his private chambers. He was a stern older man with a completely bald head and incredibly sharp, calculating eyes. The bailiff instructed everyone to stand, and then the judge sat down heavily at the high wooden bench. He immediately opened the massive manila file containing the certified financial records Marcus had formally submitted to the court. The entire massive courtroom was perfectly silent. The only sound echoing in the large room was the crisp rustling of heavy paper as the judge slowly turned the highly detailed pages. Brittany stared up at the judge with a desperate, greedy hunger burning in her eyes. She honestly still believed the legal system would somehow miraculously erase the massive commercial debt she had legally tied herself to. She thought her slick, expensive lawyer could somehow convince the judge that she was an innocent, vulnerable victim of a massive, cruel financial conspiracy orchestrated by a vindictive old man. But seasoned family court judges do not care about fake emotional victim narratives when there is a massive mountain of certified corporate accounting sitting directly in front of them. The judge spent 20 full minutes meticulously reading the detailed financial audits. He carefully traced the massive $1,500,000 commercial loan from my private holding company directly into the architecture firm operational accounts. He traced every single dollar that had been spent, wasted, and completely lost by my weak, incompetent son over the past 6 years. He read the exact dates and the exact massive amounts of every single failed business transaction. The judge finally closed the massive file and looked directly down at Brittany and her highly expensive lawyer. His lined face was completely devoid of any human sympathy. He spoke in a loud, clear, authoritative voice that echoed sharply off the cold marble walls. He stated that he had thoroughly reviewed the entire complex financial history of the marital estate and the associated corporate entity. He looked directly at Brittany and told her that she had aggressively and repeatedly petitioned this court for exactly 50% of the total marital assets. He confirmed for the official court record that she was absolutely legally entitled to receive exactly half of the corporate architecture firm today. Brittany let out a small, sudden breath of relief, thinking she had somehow magically won the massive legal battle. She actually smiled a brief, arrogant smile at Derek. But her pathetic relief did not even last a single full second. The judge did not stop speaking. He immediately continued delivering his absolutely devastating legal verdict. He stated that taking half of a corporate business entity legally requires accepting half of its total verified commercial liabilities. He looked right into her pale, terrified face and clearly explained that the architecture firm currently possessed absolutely zero liquid assets. He told her the company was completely bankrupt and held a massive legally binding debt to my private holding company. He formally ruled with absolute finality that Brittany was now personally and legally responsible for exactly $750,000 of the outstanding commercial business loan. The smug, arrogant expression completely evaporated from her face in an instant. The crushing, terrible reality of her massive, total failure finally crashed down heavily upon her shoulders. She was not walking away from this broken marriage as a wealthy, independent corporate executive. She was walking away hundreds of thousands of dollars in severe, inescapable legal debt. She opened her mouth to argue, but absolutely no sound came out. Her throat was completely paralyzed by pure, unadulterated fear. Her expensive lawyer quickly put a stern warning hand on her arm, telling her to remain quiet, but she angrily shoved his hand away. She stood up from her leather chair and yelled frantically at the judge, claiming that the massive corporate loan was a complete and total illegal fraud. The judge grabbed his heavy wooden gavel and slammed it down so hard the loud, violent sound made her jump backward in terror. He sternly warned her to remain completely silent and sit down immediately, or she would face instant arrest for criminal contempt of court. He looked at her with profound, deep disgust and told her the certified financial records were absolutely irrefutable under the law. But the judge was not entirely finished delivering his complete, devastating legal verdict yet. He picked up a second, much thinner file from his cluttered wooden desk. He looked directly at her slick, sweating lawyer and brought up the highly specific issue of the massive missing operational funds that Marcus had aggressively brought to their legal attention. The judge stated that an extensive forensic accounting investigation authorized by the court had successfully located the stolen corporate money. He detailed the hundreds of thousands of dollars Brittany had secretly and illegally transferred from the architecture firm into a highly secure private offshore account located in the Cayman Islands. He looked down at her shaking form and explained that intentionally hiding marital assets during an active legal divorce proceeding was a severe criminal violation of state law. He stated that she had maliciously and intentionally drained the very company she was now trying to aggressively squeeze for massive personal profit. He told her she had committed massive financial fraud against her husband and the legitimate corporate creditors. Brittany began to violently hyperventilate in the quiet courtroom. She gripped the edge of the heavy wooden defense table so tightly her knuckles turned completely white just to keep herself from completely collapsing onto the floor. That hidden offshore account was her ultimate secret safety net. It was the stolen money she desperately planned to use to fund her new luxurious single life and officially launch her pathetic lifestyle brand after the divorce. The judge stared at her with incredibly cold, angry eyes and delivered the absolute final crushing blow to her fake existence. He formally ordered the immediate total seizure and complete international repatriation of every single penny currently hidden inside her secret offshore bank account. He told her the international banking authorities had already been fully notified and the funds were officially frozen. She was not going to keep a single stolen dime. The judge firmly ruled that the seized offshore funds would be directly and entirely transferred to my private holding company to partially satisfy the massive corporate debt she now legally owed me. He carefully explained the brutal financial math to her. He stated that even after the stolen money was completely surrendered and applied to her balance, she would still personally owe my holding company over $400,000 in outstanding commercial debt. He explained that my company would be granted a legal judgment to aggressively garnish her future wages and seize any future assets she ever acquired until the massive debt was completely paid in full. He officially finalized the absolute marital split and signed the heavy legal documents with his thick black pen. The loud scratch of his pen against the paper was the sound of her entire fake, luxurious universe being completely and permanently destroyed forever. The formal family court hearing was officially entirely concluded. Brittany completely lost whatever tiny shred of mental sanity she had left holding her together. She turned violently toward her highly expensive lawyer and began screaming at the absolute top of her lungs. She yelled that he was a completely useless, pathetic idiot who had explicitly promised to make her incredibly rich and completely destroy my son. She screamed that he had ruined her entire life and that she was absolutely never going to pay his massive legal fees. The lawyer did not even try to calm her down. He quickly packed his heavy legal documents into his thick briefcase and walked rapidly out of the courtroom, completely ignoring her violent public meltdown. He was a professional who knew that a completely bankrupt, deeply indebted client was absolutely useless to his prestigious law firm. Brittany then turned her pure, venomous anger directly toward Derek sitting across the wide aisle. She screamed that he was a weak, disgusting, pathetic failure who had intentionally trapped her in a massive, inescapable mountain of terrible legal debt. She yelled that she completely hated him and wished she had absolutely never met him in her entire miserable life. Derek did not say a single word in response to her vicious screaming. He just sat at his table, staring completely blankly at the dark wooden floor. He looked entirely dead inside, completely numb to her aggressive, violent insults. The judge had absolutely zero patience left for her terrible behavior. He immediately ordered the heavy-armed bailiffs to forcefully remove the screaming woman from his quiet, dignified courtroom. Two very large men wearing thick, dark uniforms rushed forward and grabbed her tightly by the arms. They forcefully dragged her backwards away from the tables. She fought them incredibly violently, kicking her expensive designer shoes against the hard marble floor and twisting her body in absolute desperation. She screamed my name loudly, demanding that I give her the massive amounts of money she still falsely felt she fully deserved. She sounded exactly like a terrifying wild animal caught tightly in a heavy, brutal steel trap. I sat completely still in the back row of the wooden gallery and watched her being dragged out through the heavy wooden double doors of the courtroom. My face remained entirely blank and completely unreadable. I did not smile a victorious smile. I did not gloat or cheer. I felt absolutely zero personal pleasure in watching another human being completely destroy their own pathetic, ruined life. I only felt the cold, hard satisfaction of a massive, necessary job finally being successfully completed. The dangerous, venomous rot had been completely and surgically cut out of our lives forever. The heavy wooden courtroom doors slammed shut completely, cutting off the loud echoing sounds of her desperate, pathetic screaming in the hallway. The quiet, massive courtroom instantly returned to its peaceful, solemn state. The stern judge gathered his thick, heavy files and quietly exited through his private door without looking back. Marcus placed his final documents securely back into his heavy leather briefcase. He turned around and gave me a single, respectful, solid nod before walking out the main doors to return to his busy corporate office. I was finally left completely alone in the massive, silent room with my son. Derek slowly stood up from the respondent table, rubbing his tired eyes. He looked around the empty, cold courtroom as if he did not know exactly where he was or how he had gotten there. His massive million-dollar architecture firm was now officially completely bankrupt and completely dead. His incredibly beautiful, wealthy wife was gone forever, leaving him with absolutely nothing but a shattered heart and terrible, traumatizing memories. The grand, fake illusion of his highly successful, independent life was entirely broken into a million tiny, unfixable pieces. He had absolutely nothing left to hide behind anymore. He slowly turned his body around and looked up at me, sitting quietly in the back row of the heavy wooden gallery benches. He looked at me with eyes completely full of profound, deep regret and absolute crushing sorrow. He finally understood the massive, terrifying cost of his own weak, pathetic cowardice. He had foolishly sacrificed the strong, reliable father who gave him absolutely everything for a cruel, arrogant woman who tried to steal his entire world. I stood up from the wooden bench. I carefully buttoned my charcoal wool suit jacket and picked up my own small leather portfolio. I looked down at the broken man standing in the aisle, and I saw the little boy I had desperately tried to protect from the cruel, unforgiving world so many years ago. But I finally realized with absolute perfect clarity that I could never truly protect him from himself. His total, complete ruin was the absolute necessary price he had to pay to finally learn what it actually means to be a real independent man. I did not offer him a warm, comforting hug. I did not tell him that I would immediately fix his massive, terrible problems or pay off his remaining massive debts. I simply turned away from him and began walking slowly and deliberately toward the heavy wooden doors, leaving him standing completely alone in the cold, silent reality of his own making. 6 full months passed since the heavy wooden doors of the family courtroom closed firmly behind my son. The hot summer completely faded away, surrendering to a bitter, freezing winter that covered the city in gray slush. The massive estate remained perfectly quiet and entirely secure under my sole legal control. I did not sell the physical property immediately. I spent my days slowly repairing the severe structural damage Brittany had maliciously inflicted on my beautiful guest house. Every single time I replaced a shattered glass window or sanded down the ruined oak floors, I felt my soul healing completely. The intense physical labor was highly therapeutic for a man who had spent his entire life building solid foundations. It reminded me that broken things can always be rebuilt if you have the right tools and enough patience. But some things in this world are completely beyond repair. Brittany's massive fake empire of absolute luxury was entirely destroyed forever. Her prestigious corporate career was totally dead and buried. Because of the severe felony vandalism charges and the massive public scandal, no reputable public relations firm in the entire country would ever dare to hire her again today or completely permanently. She was completely blacklisted from the elite corporate world she once proudly ruled. The highly expensive lifestyle brand she desperately tried to launch was entirely abandoned before it even began. She had absolutely no capital and zero social influence left to leverage. Instead of attending wealthy charity galas and drinking imported champagne, she was now forced to face the harsh, brutal reality of the working class. Brittany was currently employed as a basic hostess at a loud, crowded, mid-tier family restaurant located in a highly undesirable suburban neighborhood, far away from the wealthy city center, completely downtown right now. She was required to wear a cheap polyester uniform that consisted of tight black slacks and a highly unflattering, bright red polo shirt. The shirt had a silly cartoon mascot heavily embroidered right on the front pocket. She spent her long, miserable shifts standing near the drafty front doors, smiling fake, exhausted smiles at noisy families and impatient customers. She was constantly verbally abused by angry patrons who complained about long wait times and cold food. She had to politely apologize to people she once considered completely beneath her absolute supreme social status every single day, right there constantly now. When her exhausting restaurant shift finally ended, she did not drive home in a sleek, imported luxury sports car. Her beautiful, expensive vehicles had been completely repossessed by the banks months ago. She was forced to take the slow, crowded city bus back to her completely depressing new residence. She lived in a very cramped, filthy studio apartment located above a noisy, busy laundromat. The tiny apartment constantly smelled like cheap detergent and old, stale cigarette smoke. There were no vaulted ceilings, no wide plank oak floors, and absolutely no custom glass windows in her completely miserable home at all. Her entire living space was smaller than the luxurious master bathroom she had once occupied at my massive estate. She slept on a cheap, uncomfortable mattress placed directly on the cold-stained linoleum floor because she could not afford to buy a proper bed frame. Her expensive designer clothes were packed tightly into cheap plastic garbage bags stacked in the dark corner of the tiny room. But the absolute worst part of her miserable new existence was the massive financial weight crushing her daily. The family court judge had completely honored his devastating legal promise to me entirely right now. Every single time she received her small, pathetic paycheck from the loud restaurant, a massive portion of her hard-earned wages was automatically heavily garnished. The money was instantly digitally transferred directly to my private commercial holding company to slowly satisfy the massive corporate debt she legally owed me. She was working incredibly long, exhausting hours just to hand over most of her money to the older black man she had once viciously called a pathetic freeloader. The profound absolute irony of her terrible situation was a completely perfect example of total supreme cosmic justice every single day, endlessly forever. She had tried to steal my massive wealth to fund her arrogant life, but now her own miserable labor was entirely funding my holding company. She was completely trapped in a massive, inescapable financial prison of her own making. She had absolutely no wealthy friends left to rescue her from the deep, dark hole. They had all completely abandoned her the exact moment her embarrassing police mugshot went viral online. She was entirely alone, bitter, and completely broken. Meanwhile, my son Derek was experiencing his own unique, massive version of terrible, brutal reality, completely on the other side right now. Derek was forced to completely liquidate his hollow million-dollar architecture firm. He formally declared total personal and corporate bankruptcy, dissolving the fake business he had proudly built using my massive financial sacrifices. The expensive downtown office space was immediately cleared out, and the shiny corporate credit cards were permanently shredded. He lost his fancy title of Chief Executive Officer completely forever, because he possessed absolutely no real executive business experience without my secret financial backing. He struggled heavily to find a new job. He was completely unemployable at the highest elite corporate levels in our city, completely, permanently today. After months of desperate, humiliating interviews, he was finally hired as a basic junior draftsman at a large, highly aggressive rival architecture firm. He was no longer the arrogant boss calling the shots from a massive corner office with beautiful panoramic city views. He was now just a lowly, anonymous employee sitting in a tiny gray fabric cubicle, completely surrounded by dozens of other young, eager junior workers. He spent his long, miserable days silently drawing incredibly boring structural lines on a computer screen for projects he would never actually get any formal professional credit for whatsoever at all today. He was constantly ordered around by senior managers who were much younger and far more talented than he ever was. He had to fetch hot coffee for the wealthy senior partners and quietly endure their harsh professional criticisms without arguing back. He was earning a very basic entry-level salary that barely covered his simple monthly living expenses. He could no longer afford to maintain his expensive country club memberships or buy custom tailored linen suits. He had to sell his sleek silver luxury car to pay off his massive outstanding personal legal fees entirely, completely, outright, right away, today. He was now fully forced to take the crowded, loud public transit bus to work every single cold morning. He stood freezing at the bus stop, wearing a cheap, heavy winter coat, completely blending in with the tired working-class masses he used to arrogantly look down upon. He finally truly understood what it actually meant to work incredibly hard for a tiny, pathetic paycheck. He finally realized the massive, overwhelming pressure I had quietly endured for 40 long years to provide him with a perfectly soft, completely shielded, luxurious existence from the very brutal, real world, completely, unconditionally, forever. The massive pain of losing his beautiful fake life had completely humbled him. He did not date anyone new. He did not go out drinking with wealthy friends on the busy weekends. He spent his quiet evenings sitting alone in his small rented apartment, eating cheap canned soup and staring completely blankly at the bare walls. His entire universe had shrunk down to the absolute bare minimum required for basic human survival. He was finally paying the heavy, massive toll for his extreme cowardice and his profound, absolute betrayal of the very blood that created his existence, completely, permanently today. 6 full months of total agonizing silence stretched between us like a massive frozen ocean. I did not attempt to contact him, and he did not dare to reach out to me. He completely understood that the heavy bridges were entirely burned to the ground. But the universe has a very strange, funny way of forcing paths to unexpectedly cross. It happened on a completely random, chilly Tuesday afternoon in the middle of the busy, bustling downtown financial district. I had just finished a highly productive corporate meeting with my ruthless property lawyer Marcus right nearby, entirely, completely alone today. I decided to stop at a quiet upscale corner cafe to enjoy a warm cup of premium dark roast coffee. I was wearing my favorite tailored charcoal wool overcoat and sitting comfortably at a small round table near the large glass window. I was calmly watching the heavy crowds of busy professionals walking rapidly down the cold gray sidewalk. Suddenly, the loud bell above the cafe door chimed brightly. A cold rush of bitter winter wind blew directly into the warm, cozy shop. I slowly turned my head and looked directly at the newly arrived customer stepping completely inside today. It was Derek. He was wearing his cheap, faded winter coat and carrying a highly worn leather messenger bag over his tired shoulder. He looked incredibly thin and deeply exhausted. He stepped up to the counter to order a basic black coffee. As he turned around to wait for his drink, his sad, weary eyes slowly scanned the quiet room. Our eyes locked perfectly together across the short physical distance. Time seemed to completely stop in the busy cafe. He froze entirely, holding his breath, completely shocked to see me sitting there looking so perfectly peaceful, completely silent right now. He took a tiny, hesitant step forward, opening his mouth as if he desperately wanted to speak to me. He desperately wanted the warm comfort of his strong, old father, but I did not smile. I did not wave my hand or slide the empty chair out to invite him to sit down. I simply looked directly into his eyes and gave him one single brief, solemn nod of basic human acknowledgement. The firm, absolute boundaries were completely established. He stopped walking immediately. He nodded slowly back, accepting his fate. He took his coffee and walked completely away forever today. The harsh winter finally melted away, leaving behind a bright, warm spring that breathed entirely new life into the massive estate. I walked through the grand, empty halls of the main house, listening to the quiet sound of my own footsteps echoing against the expensive, wide plank oak floors. The house was completely silent now. It was entirely free from the toxic, arrogant venom that Brittany had constantly infected it with. It was completely free from the pathetic, heavy cowardice that my son Derek had dragged through these beautiful rooms every single day. I spent a few weeks living quietly in the restored guest house, enjoying the profound, absolute peace of finally being completely alone. But as I walked across the massive manicured lawns and looked up at the towering roof lines, I slowly realized a very deep and important truth. This massive fortress was simply too big for one old man. I built this incredible sprawling estate to be a permanent safe haven for my family. I built it to be a massive generational legacy that would protect my bloodline from the harsh, unforgiving world. But the family I built it for did not actually exist anymore. The son I tried to protect had completely failed the ultimate test of character. The legacy of this physical land was now permanently stained by incredibly dark, terrible memories of profound betrayal. I did not want to spend the rest of my quiet remaining years wandering like a lonely ghost through a massive empty museum dedicated entirely to a completely broken past. It was finally time to completely close this incredibly heavy chapter of my life forever. I picked up my phone and called my highly aggressive corporate attorney, Marcus, one final time. I told him to completely dissolve the physical real estate assets held tightly within the irrevocable trust. I instructed him to hire a premium commercial real estate broker and list the entire 3-acre estate on the highly exclusive private luxury market. Because the property was entirely custom built with the absolute highest quality commercial grade materials and featured state-of-the-art hidden security systems, it did not stay on the market for very long at all. Less than a month later, a highly successful, wealthy technology executive from the West Coast flew in and toured the beautiful property. He immediately fell completely in love with the custom woodwork, the massive heated swimming pool, and the profound absolute privacy the heavy iron gates provided. He offered to buy the entire estate completely outright in a massive straight cash transaction. The final purchase price was absolutely staggering. It was many millions of dollars. When the heavy legal closing documents were finally officially signed and the massive sum of liquid cash was securely digitally transferred into my private holding company, I handed over the heavy brass master keys without a single ounce of emotional regret. I drove my old reliable Ford truck out of the massive iron gates for the very last time, and I absolutely never looked back at the grand fake illusion I had foolishly built for an ungrateful, cowardly son. I was now sitting on a massive mountain of liquid wealth. I had more money than I could ever possibly spend in 10 complete lifetimes. But I knew from watching my own son completely fail that unearned wealth is actually a massive, deadly poison. Money without a strong, absolute purpose only breeds severe, arrogant entitlement and profound weakness. I thought deeply about my beautiful late wife, Rosalind. I remembered the incredibly hard early years of our marriage when we had absolutely nothing but a cheap set of tools and a massive burning desire to completely succeed. We built our highly successful commercial electrical and heating business entirely through pure, exhausting physical labor and massive, unwavering determination. We did not have any wealthy parents to quietly bail us out when the commercial invoices were paid late. We survived because we were incredibly strong and completely hungry for a better life. I realized that my massive, terrible mistake with Derek was entirely rooted in my deep, desperate desire to completely eliminate his hunger. I had foolishly built a soft, luxurious world where he never had to struggle or sweat or bleed for his own dinner. By completely removing his necessary struggles, I had unintentionally successfully removed his entire backbone. I decided right then and there that I was going to use my massive wealth to completely change my legacy. I was not going to give my money to a weak, cowardly son. I was going to give my money to young men who possessed the exact same desperate, hungry fire that I had when I was a poor young man trying to survive in a cruel, unforgiving city. I purchased a massive abandoned brick warehouse located deep inside one of the most heavily impoverished, neglected neighborhoods in the entire city. It was a completely forgotten building sitting in a forgotten part of town, completely surrounded by severe poverty and massive lack of opportunity. I hired a massive crew of highly skilled local commercial contractors to completely gut the interior of the old warehouse. We completely replaced the broken roof, poured brand new smooth concrete floors, and installed state-of-the-art massive training laboratories. We built incredibly complex mock electrical grids, advanced commercial heating and cooling ventilation shafts, and fully functional industrial plumbing walls. I spent several millions of dollars transforming the dark abandoned warehouse into a completely modern, beautiful world-class technical training facility. I officially named it the Rosalind Trade Academy in profound, absolute loving honor of the incredibly strong, brilliant woman who had stood faithfully by my side when we had absolutely nothing but dirt on our shoes. The academy was explicitly designed to be a completely free, comprehensive vocational training program specifically targeting underprivileged young black men from the surrounding harsh neighborhoods. These were young men who had been completely written off by the traditional education system. These were kids who were constantly told they would absolutely never amount to anything in this completely harsh world today. I did not just passively fund the massive, beautiful academy and quietly walk away. I actively participated in the incredibly rigorous initial interview process for the very first incoming class of young students. I sat across the table from young men who wore cheap, faded clothes and heavily scuffed shoes. I looked directly into their eyes and I saw the exact same massive, deep, desperate hunger that used to keep me awake late at night 50 long years ago. They did not want soft, luxurious handouts. They desperately wanted a legitimate fighting chance to completely build a solid, reliable life with their own two calloused hands. I provided them with completely free, heavy-duty tools, thick, warm safety gear, and highly intensive expert instruction from the best retired commercial contractors in the entire state. I watched these young men completely transform over the following long months. I watched them learn how to perfectly wire complex, massive electrical panels and successfully diagnose highly complicated commercial refrigeration systems. I watched them develop profound, absolute, deep self-respect and incredibly strong personal discipline. When the very first class finally officially graduated, every single young man was immediately offered a highly lucrative, secure union job. I had successfully built a massive machine that turned deep poverty into permanent, powerful generational wealth. I gave them the exact heavy tools they desperately needed to successfully build their own massive secure fortresses, completely, entirely on their own. The Rosalind Trade Academy was a massive, incredible, permanent success. I established a massive, highly secure, irrevocable endowment to ensure the beautiful school would continue to completely operate perfectly, completely free of charge for many generations to come. My massive financial legacy was finally entirely secure and completely pure. I had successfully corrected the massive, terrible mistake I made with my own ungrateful, cowardly son. With my absolute, profound duty finally fully completed, I realized the loud, crowded city no longer held any personal appeal for me whatsoever at all. The heavy traffic, the dirty concrete sidewalks, and the constant loud noise of urban life felt incredibly suffocating to my tired old bones. I wanted profound, absolute, total, complete, unbroken peace. I wanted to completely disappear into the quiet, natural world and simply be entirely alone with my own clear, calm thoughts. I traveled far away from the massive city, completely leaving the heavy drama and the toxic, greedy people entirely behind me forever. I drove for many long days across the massive, beautiful country until I finally reached the deep, incredibly quiet, rugged mountains of the great state of Montana. I purchased a beautiful, highly modest wooden cabin situated directly on the quiet, pristine shores of a massive, deep blue freshwater lake. The cabin was completely surrounded by towering ancient green pine trees and massive, rugged, snow-capped mountain peaks. There were absolutely no loud neighbors, no fancy gated driveways, and absolutely zero arrogant, greedy people anywhere for many miles around. The small, simple cabin was built from incredibly thick solid cedar logs and featured a very simple, sturdy metal roof that completely sang a beautiful, quiet song whenever the heavy rain fell deeply from the dark gray sky. I did not hire a premium luxury landscaping company to cut the wild grass, and I certainly did not hire a private catering chef to cook my basic meals. I completely maintained the small, rugged property entirely with my own two hands, exactly the way a real independent man is absolutely supposed to live his quiet life. I chopped my own heavy firewood, stacked it perfectly neatly against the thick wooden walls, and breathed in the incredibly crisp, freezing clean mountain air every single quiet morning today entirely. I finally felt a deep, massive sense of total, complete relief wash over my entire weary soul. The toxic, heavy burdens of my past life were completely lifted and entirely destroyed forever. It is now late afternoon and the bright golden sun is slowly beginning to dip deeply behind the massive purple mountain peaks. I am sitting quietly in a highly comfortable, worn wooden rocking chair on the sturdy back porch of my beautiful, simple cabin. The deep blue lake water is incredibly calm, completely reflecting the bright orange and pink colors of the massive fading sky perfectly, like a giant flat glass mirror. I have a long, simple fishing pole resting easily in my strong, weathered hands, and a warm ceramic mug of premium dark roast coffee sitting quietly on the wooden railing right next to me. The absolute, profound, unbroken silence of the deep forest is the most incredibly beautiful sound I have ever completely heard in my entire long life. There is absolutely no ringing telephone to completely disturb my massive peace. There is absolutely no pathetic begging son asking for a secret financial bailout. And there is absolutely no arrogant, greedy daughter-in-law screaming completely insane, violent threats into the dark, cold night. My massive financial wealth is completely, perfectly secure. My profound, beautiful legacy is completely safely protected within the strong young men currently building a highly successful new world back in the noisy city. I successfully completely protected my own deep personal peace. I survived the toxic, venomous rot, and I successfully, completely, surgically removed it from my entire existence permanently, entirely, forever. Blood does not grant you a blank check to my dignity. I spent my life building a fortress so my son would never know the cold, but in doing so, I raised a man who could not recognize a predator until she was eating at his table. When arrogance mistook my silence for weakness, I did not raise my voice. I simply removed the foundation they were standing on. True power is not in screaming the loudest. It is in knowing your worth, cutting out the rot without hesitation, and understanding that respect is the only currency I completely accept. If you found value in my journey and learned something from my silent adjustment, please consider hitting the like button and subscribing to the channel right now. Leave a comment below telling me where you are watching from and what you would have done if your own family completely betrayed your profound sacrifices. Thank you so much for listening, and I will see you in the next incredible life story.